Ever wondered what it's like to sleep inside a frozen loaf of bread, wrapped in wet burlap, while a ghost screams outside your window, "Welcome to winter," as a medieval commoner? Before you even think of complaining about your heating bill, allow me to take you back to a time where survival meant more than comfort. It meant clawing your way through the cold with nothing but mud walls and a goat-smelling cloak. Tonight, we dive into the astonishing endurance of people like Wolfgar and his wife Eleanordinary Souls, from the frost-bitten village of Bramble Hollow, who fought not wars, but blizzards every single night. These folks didn't have electric blankets or warm coffee. They had hay, they had livestock, they had each other, and somehow they made it work. So before you tuck yourself in, go ahead and follow or subscribe the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and how many blankets you've got on right now. Because by the end of this, you might need an extra one. Now dim the lights, maybe light a candle, for atmosphere, not heat. We're not savages. And settle in as we unearth what it really meant to survive a medieval winter without losing your fingers, mind, or hope. When someone mentions medieval life, your imagination probably drifts toward armored knights thundering across jousting fields, noble banquets overflowing with roast boar, and jugglers doing backflips in town squares. But for the everyday villager in Bramble Hollow, winter wasn't a fairy tale, it was a trap. Not a season of snowflakes and sleigh rides, but a relentless, freezing gauntlet from which many didn't emerge. Imagine this. Your home is a hut made of woven sticks, smeared with mud, straw, and animal droppings, like someone tried to build a house while blindfolded and drunk. No insulation. No glass windows, just holes stuffed with oily goat hides. And the interior temperature? Only marginally more generous than the frost outside. If it was 5 degrees Celsius outdoors, it was a balmy 3 degrees Celsius inside. Hooray, progress! Nights were merciless. Darkness poured in like ink, erasing all but the glow of the hearth, which was less of a fireplace and more of a tired pile of smoldering disappointment. The wind outside moaned like a banshee with marital problems, rattling through every crack in the walls. If you were lucky enough to sit closest to the fire, your toes might just defrost. If not, you may as well have slept in a snowbank wearing a potato sack. Peasant clothes were not fashion statements. They were layers of rough wool, stitched together with more hope than skill. Tunics, cloaks, and the occasional fur, if a fox was foolish enough to cross your path, were worn year-round, gaining more stink than style. You didn't change clothes for the seasons. You just added more of them until you resembled a woolen scarecrow. Beds? That's generous. What most villagers had were wooden frames topped with straw. Not the soft golden kind from storybooks. This straw was crunchy, itchy, and full of bugs who paid no rent and offered zero companionship. Some slept on bare dirt floors, softened with old rushes. And those rushes were rarely replaced. They just added new ones on top of the old, creating layers of decay and mystery creatures like compost, but with more fleas. Waking up each morning wasn't guaranteed. Frostbite lurked in your sleep. Your own house was a threat. Children and the elderly often didn't survive the coldest nights. So if you opened your eyes and still had all your fingers, congratulations. That alone was cause for celebration. Breakfast might include a turnip that was slightly less frozen than yesterday's. A delicacy. And if you think your apartment's a bit breezy, oh, friend, you know nothing of draft. Bramble Hollow huts were like wind tunnels with aspirations. They weren't buildings so much as suggestions of shelter. Historians kindly refer to this as wattle and daub construction, translated sticks, smeared with whatever the builder stepped in that morning. Dung, yes, actual dung was key. Cow, horse, sometimes pig, all blended with straw and mud to create a paste that dried into something vaguely wall-like. It was cheap, sticky, and conveniently always underfoot. It may not have smelled great, but it filled the gaps and helped trap heat. Sort of, until the wind found another hole to whistle through and turned your home into a medieval wind chime. The roofs didn't offer much mercy either. Thatch was the go-to material, lightweight and easy to repair, which was good because it needed constant fixing. Rain, snow, and rodents had a field day with it. Sometimes you'd be enjoying your only bowl of hot turnip broth when a rat, squirrel, or deeply confused bird would fall through the ceiling. Surprise protein. Windows were rare. If your home had one, it was barely bigger than a squirrel hole and likely covered with a translucent animal hide or wooden shutter. Glass was for kings, bishops, and that one merchant with too much money and not enough sense. Everyone else just hoped the wind wouldn't tear the hide off mid-blizzard. The floor? Picture a compacted patch of dirt, damp and unforgiving. No tiles, no planks, just the cold, unfeeling earth. When snow piled outside, moisture crept up from below, turning your home into a mud spa with none of the benefits. Your socks? Perpetually soggy. Your dignity? Frozen solid. Still, the villagers of Bramble Hollow weren't quitters. They stuffed moss in the wall cracks, used leftover rags to plug gaps, and even rubbed sheep tallow into the wood for extra insulation. It didn't smell great, but it beat freezing. They slept huddled together, sharing body heat, often curling up with goats or chickens for warmth. Forget fancy down comforters. This was real, raw human insulation. And let's not forget the real battlefield, the floor. Sleeping just inches above the earth meant that icy fingers crept up through the straw, whispering chilling threats straight into your bones. Some villagers tried layering mats of stolen straw. You heard right straw theft was a crime of survival. But straw flattened fast, grew mold faster, and offered all the warmth of a cold handshake. Over time, homes built up years of rotting rushes, layered like sediment. In between, fleas, mold, and whatever night-crawling things fancied the flavor of medieval toes. The smell? An acquired taste. But hey, at least it was consistent. Beds didn't improve things. Wooden frames topped with straw again, and if you were lucky, maybe some tattered fabric over it. No springs, no pillows. Just the constant, desperate shuffle to stay warm. Every turn was a negotiation between your frozen shoulder and your half-thawed thigh. But in all of this frosty misery, there was one hero, the hearth. No, not a fireplace in the modern sense. Just a humble pit or pile of stones in the center of the hut, where flames flickered like defiant little warriors. There were no chimneys. Smoke swirled through the room, escaping through holes in the thatch, cracks in the walser, not at all. If the smoke felt lazy, it just sat with you, turning your lungs into a second-hand bonfire. The smoke wasn't great for your health, but on the upside, it drove out fleas and other pests. Free fumigation. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in soot? That little fire pit was everything. It gave light, cooked what little food you had, dried your clothes, if you didn't burn them, and served as the heart of the home. Villagers would gather around it, telling stories, whispering prayers, or just staring into the flames and trying not to think about how cold their toes still were. Letting the fire die overnight was not an option. It had to be kept alive like a tiny dragon with a bad attitude. Coals were banked, logs carefully rationed. Ellen once burned her husband's walking stick during a particularly brutal frost. Wolfgar didn't even get mad. He just nodded. Survival first. So no, medieval peasants weren't basking in luxury, but they endured. Through ingenuity, community, and a healthy disregard for comfort, they faced each winter like warriors mud-streaked, goat-scented warriors. And that is only the beginning. You think forgetting to turn the heat on at night is rough? Try sleeping through a medieval winter where the wind has teeth and the walls are made of soggy hope. In Bramble Hollow, nightfall wasn't just a time, it was an invitation for death to come knocking. And if your hearth fire died out, you might as well have written your own medieval obituary. Getting a fire started again wasn't as simple as striking a match. Matches didn't exist, and neither did mercy. Lighting a fire meant fumbling with frozen fingers, bashing flint and steel together, like you were trying to open a portal to warmth through sheer willpower. The process took time, skill, and usually enough whispered prayers to shame a priest. There were no takebacks, no second chances. If you failed to reignite the flames in time, the frost would happily claim your nose, your toes, and whatever hope you had left. In families like Wolfgar and Ellen's, everyone played a part. It was an all-night relay of keeping the fire alive. One watched the embers. Another added dried peat or kindling. If you had the blessing of a dry stick, you guarded it like treasure. Children were taught the importance of fire from the moment they could walk. Forget fairy tale toddlers learned the rituals of firebanking before they knew how to count to 10. The hearth, humble and smoky, was no luxury. It didn't promise warmth, it promised a fighting chance. Without it, survival wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. A weak fire could still keep your bones from shattering under the cold, your breath from freezing mid-air, and the deathly silence from creeping too close. What did peasants fear more than disease or bandits? Easy, waking up to a dead fire. That flickering flame was the lifeline, the one thing standing between your family and a frozen goodbye. Without it, the cold swept in faster than a landlord after harvest season, curling into your bones and stealing what little strength you had left. And in the thick of winter, starting from scratch was more than inconvenient, it was brutal. No lighters, no fuel canisters, no spark clicks. Just bitter, cold, tired hands and a few brittle sticks that might as well have been cursed. So the wise ones, those who had lasted more than a couple of winters, learned to bank the fire, not with coins, but with ash. Before bed, they'd bury the hot embers under a soft mound of ash, like tucking in a sleeping dragon. The ash worked as a thermal blanket, keeping the coals just warm enough to survive the long, bitter night. If you did it right, morning came with a glow beneath the gray pile, a quick poke, a breath of life, and hallelujah flames. But if you botched it, if the wind crept in, or your mound was too tight, welcome to day 0 of hypothermia school. Firebanking became a family art, passed down like secret recipes, and better than average turnip stew. Everyone had their methods. Some swore by dry ash, others liked it slightly damp. Some piled the coals gently, others packed them tight. Suggesting a better technique was the medieval equivalent of telling your uncle he grills meat wrong. Prepare for an argument that ends with someone storming off into the frost. Even with careful banking, there were risks. A stray gust could snake through a wall crack and kill the coals. A sheep could stumble into the hearthays. That happened more than once. This was why many families set rotating shifts. Ellen once woke Wolfgar 3 times in one night, just to make sure the fire hadn't given up. He groaned, but he got up because if the fire died, someone else might not wake up. The fire was never really mastered. It was bargained with, protected, and coaxed back to life. And some mornings, when just one ember remained, glowing gone's stubborn ember refusing to surrender it, was like winning the lottery. Except instead of gold, you got warmth, and that was worth far more in Bramble Hollow. Now, if you think medieval folks were isolated during the cold months, think again. In the winter, personal space wasn't just rarate, was abolished. Survival meant closeness. And by closeness, we mean stacked like laundry in the corner of a freezing closet. The phrase, the more, the merrier, was less about parties and more about whether your ears froze off by dawn. Entire households, from grandparents to newborns, plus a goose or two, huddled together in a great heap of limbs, cloth, and desperation. You didn't sleep so much as nest in a human casserole. Babies were wrapped like burritos and placed in the center of the pile. Frail elders were sandwiched in tight. The stronger family members, those with a bit of meat on their bones or thicker blood, lined the outer edge like warm, grumbling shields. Did anyone get a good night's sleep? Not really. But it wasn't about rest, it was about not becoming a peasant sickle. And there were unwritten rules. Move too much, you'd knock someone into the drafty corner. Snore too loud, prepare for a foot in your ribs. Once, Cousin Aldwin rolled over and sent Aunt Hild off the straw mattress entirely. She didn't speak to him for 3 days. Survival was serious, but even in the frost, drama found its way in. Hygiene? Let's just say it was a sacrifice. Layers of unwashed wool, greasy hair, and the occasional livestock fart made for a perfume that would peel bark off trees. But nobody complained. Smell was temporary. Death, unfortunately, wasn't. Interestingly, there was some strategy involved. Warmest bodies on the outside, weakest in the core. Think of it like thermal chess. The goal? Keep the vital pieces alive. You didn't get to choose a spot, you earned it by mass, age, or being particularly cuddly. This communal approach extended to the rest of the household, two livestock included. When temperatures dropped, animals came inside, not as guests, as living heaters. Cows, goats, chickens, and pigs shared the living space, not out of affection, but necessity. Each beast brought precious degrees of warmth. And besides, if your goat was sleeping against the wall, it was harder for your neighbor to accidentally steal it during the night. Nighttime in Bramble Hollow was chaotic. Chickens nestled under benches or flapped to rafters. Pigs rooted for snacks near the hearth. Cows plopped down like oversized dogs and chewed cud while ignoring everyone. The place stank to high heaven, but it was warm-ish, and that's what counted. Of course, this setup came with hazards. Many peasants were rudely awakened by a goat stepping on their face or a chicken trying to nest in their hair. And don't even mention the things people stepped in during those sleepy midnight wanderings. But the peasants endured because the equation was simple. 1 cow equals 2 warmer humans. The smells, the noise, the complete lack of dignity of it was the cost of survival. It was an uneasy alliance between man and beast, bound not by love, but shared desperation. And when it came to dressing for the cold, fashion was not a concern. Surviving without freezing your spleen was the goal. Layering was the only rule. If you owned it, you wore it, all of it. Your base layer might be an itchy, unwashed linen tunic. Over that, a thicker wool tunic. Maybe another if your cousin hadn't borrowed it. Add some sagging wool leggings, a cloak that had more patches than fabric, and if you were blessed by the gods, a ragged sheepskin for good measure. At this point, you resembled a medieval onion, layered, emotional, and crying from the smell. Boots were rare. Most wrapped their feet in cloth, old leather scraps, or rags and shoved them into wooden clogs. If your toes still felt cold, you added another layer and hoped frostbite wasn't feeling ambitious that night. Washing clothes in winter? Forget it. That meant breaking ice at the stream, freezing your hands, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to thaw and dry, assuming it didn't turn into a linen statue. Most folks decided that wearing the same smoke-saturated, sweat-drenched tunic all season was simply more efficient. Oddly enough, all that grime had a perk: insulation. Dirt and grease locked in body heat like an accidental armor. The peasants didn't care that they reeked. They cared that they woke up still breathing. Wool caps were prized. Gloves, rare and usually homemade. Some people wrapped rags around their hands like makeshift mittens. Others just kept them inside their tunics and prayed. A decent hat could make the difference between surviving the night and having icicles for eyebrows by morning. So, next time you're tucked in with your electric heater and a fluffy duvet, think of the villagers of Bramble Hollow, the fire they banked with ash and hope, the families huddled like burritos of desperation, the cows that slept beside them like snoring, farting guardian angels. They didn't just live through winter. They stared it down, covered in dirt, wrapped in rags, and smelling like wet goat. And they won. Have you ever seen a child so overwrapped in fabric that they look more like a small furniture item than a person? Now picture that, but it's winter, there's no heat, and the child is waddling like an overstuffed turnip with legs. Welcome to medieval parenting. Fashion, irrelevant. Warmth, survival. In the frozen hamlet of Bramble Hollow, fashion died a quick, quiet death, sometime around the first snowfall. Children were bundled until their arms stuck out like stumpy wings, faces barely peeking from layers of wool, linen, and whatever vaguely cloth-like material their parents could find. Little Alric toddled around the family hut, looking less like a boy and more like a suspiciously mobile laundry sack. But he was warmened. That was the real flex in those days. Today's complaints about too many layers in winter would have gotten you laughed at or smothered under another cloak back then. Peasants wore half their belongings at once and considered it a win. You didn't worry about color coordination or stitching. If it blocked wind and didn't smell like raw fish, it was going on your back. And while we're on the subject of scent, let's talk about dirt. You might think of filth as failure lapse in cleanliness, but to the people of Bramble Hollow, dirt was strategy. It wasn't just a byproduct of surviving a muddy winter. It was part of the survival kit. You see, winter didn't just test your patience, it tested your pores. Clean clothes, especially freshly washed linen, had a problem. They were too breathable. That might sound nice in July, but in January, breathable meant freezing your butt off with style. So medieval folks did something brilliant. They got dirty and stayed that way. Day after day, grime built up on their cloaks, tunics, and leggings. Layers of sweat, soot, grease, and good old-fashioned mud became a kind of natural insulation. It plugged the holes in the fabric and blocked out the biting wind like a crusty little miracle. It was basically the medieval equivalent of waterproofing spray, except made by human funk and desperation. Yes, it was disgusting. Yes, it made you smell like a goat that lost a bar fight. But it worked. And while we're at it, let's clear up a myth. Medieval people weren't dirty because they were lazy. Quite the opposite. They chose to remain crusty. Some even believed that bathing in winter made you more vulnerable to illness. The logic? A fresh, wet body was a cold body. Better to keep your natural, funky barrier intact than risk catching death by trying to impress your neighbor with your shiny scalp. Soap, if it existed in the village at all, was reserved for high ceremonies like weddings, royal visits, or funerals. And laundry? Only if your clothes were actively trying to crawl off your body in protest. Most people simply layered up over the existing grime. Didn't change, underclothes just added more. Eventually, your outfit became a historical archive of your last 6 weeks. A patch of soup here, a wine stain there, and a mysterious streak you hoped was mud but weren't willing to confirm. To outsiders, it might have looked like peasants had given up on life, but to the peasants themselves, that crusty outer layer was a thermal shield against the reaper's chill. It wasn't glamorous. But then again, neither was dying because you wanted to smell like lavender. And since everyone stank to high heaven, nobody noticed. Or if they did, they didn't care. Nose blindness was the first gift of winter. So yes, in medieval times, dirt wasn't defeat. It was armor. It was warmth. It was identity. And if, by February, you'd earned a thick layer of goat-scented grime, you weren't losing, you were winning. But now let's take a moment to imagine where they slept. No, not on 4-poster feather beds with embroidered canopies. That's for fairy tales. The reality was significantly crunchier. Beds, if they existed, were simple wooden frames, topped with a lumpy sack stuffed with straw, old hay, or rushes. No fluff, no bounce. Just a squeaky, scratchy nest that smelled faintly of mildew in last summer's barnyard. Every movement came with a delightful rustle and the occasional sharp jab from a rebellious straw stalk. For the many who couldn't afford a frame, the bed was the floor itself. Just toss some straw on the hard-packed dirt and call it rustic living. Today's influencers might market it as earth-connected mindfulness. Back then, it was called doing your best not to die. These straw beds weren't built to last. Over time, they flattened, got moldy, and turned into bug hotels. Changing out the bedding was a major event done maybe twice a year, or when the straw became so alive it required feeding. Some peasants used rushes instead of straw-long, spongy grasses that smelled nice for approximately 20 minutes. Mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary, they gave the illusion of freshness before sinking into the usual stew of filth and foot odor. Let's not forget the bugs. Fleas, lice, and other lovable parasites adored these beds. Waking up with more bites than you went to sleep with? That was just another Tuesday in Bramble Hollow. And yet, these humble heaps of straw saved lives. They insulated against the freezing ground and gave just enough cushion to keep your hips from turning into ice cubes. Add a few family members and some livestock, and you had something vaguely resembling warmth. So the next time you flop into your memory foam mattress, think about a medieval peasant rising from his crunchy straw pile, back aching, lice scratching, but proud, because he didn't freeze. and in his world, that was a luxury. Now, when your home is made of twigs, hope, and animal poop, the cold doesn't knock at barges in uninvited. Medieval huts weren't built to keep the cold out. They were built to keep the family alive on a budget of nothing. That meant battling winter from inside the house as well as out. Walls warped, mud cracked, roofs sagged. It was like living in a house constantly trying to fall apart, one freezing breeze at a time. But peasants weren't helpless. They fought back with every scrap, rag, and tuft of moss they could find. Gap in the wall? Stuff it with moss. Wind coming through the rafters? Shove some goat hair in there. Got a draft under the door? Lay down a bundle of straw and mutter a prayer. Everything from old fabric to chicken feathers found its way into these makeshift sealants. Some took it to the next level, smearing fresh layers of mud mixed with dung across the walls. It was a full-on winter ritual. You'd find someone like Ellen out there, in the biting wind, slapping cold manure onto her house with the grim resolve of someone wallpapering her coffin. Luxury, she'd mutter. Pure luxury. Roofs were no better. Thatched and worn, they leaked after a few seasons. Gaps were stuffed with cloth, reeds, and in true emergencies chunks of sod ripped straight from a neighbor's yard. Over time, every roof became a sad patchwork of desperation, clinging together like a drunk quilt. Doors, if you had one, creaked on crude hinges. Windows, more like holes in the wall, covered with animal hide, soaked in fat, which blocked the wind and seasoned the air with eau de bacon. Every home came with its own signature smell, equal parts soot, sweat, livestock, and mystery meat. Surviving inside one of these homes meant constant vigilance. No sooner had you sealed one crack than another opened. The wind was like a prankster, always looking for the next weak spot to slap you across the face. But Bramble Hollow's peasants were relentless. Patch by patch, they outlasted winter-roan, muddy handful at a time. And when the cold got so sharp it stabbed through your dreams, that's when medieval ingenuity hit its peak. Sleep shifts. That's right. Nobody expected the entire family to sleep soundly through the night. That was a fantasy for nobles. For peasants, night was a coordinated dance of exhaustion and duty. Half the family would doze off under threadbare blankets. The other half kept the fire alive, monitored leaks, and plugged stray drafts. There was no schedule, no system. Just a mutual understanding that whoever was warm now would be on freezing duty next. Ethel might get elbowed awake at midnight, shuffle to the hearth, and jab the embers like they'd insulted her ancestors. Wulfgar would take over at dawn, grumbling and tossing more peat onto the fire while trying not to curse loud enough to wake the chickens. No one enjoyed Ember Patrol, but everyone knew what was at stake. Let the fire die, and someone else might not wake up. The stakes weren't comfort, they were survival. And sleep wasn't rest, it was a rotating pause from the constant battle against cold. So next time your heating app kicks in automatically or you grumble about getting up to adjust the thermostat, think of the frost-bitten night watchers of Bramble Hollow, poking ash piles with frozen fingers and muttering, "This ember better light or so help me." Because in medieval winter, even dreams were cold. Ever tried stoking a fire in the dead of night while half asleep, freezing, and trying not to step on a goat? That was just another normal evening in the life of a medieval peasant. No alarms, no cozy slippers, no gentle 5 more minutes snooze button, just aching knees, smoldering embers, and the ever-present fear that your fire, your only line of defense, might go out. Rotating through night duties wasn't glamorous. It was a sleep-deprived slog, usually accompanied by heavy sighs, louder snores, and someone grumbling about how unfair it was that Aunt Wenna always conveniently forgot her shift. Children, as soon as they could carry a stick without falling over, were enlisted into the night watch. The rule was simple. If you could walk, you could work. And in winter, that meant keeping the fire alive. The elderly were granted a bit of mercy sometimes. Grandfather Roderick, stiff with age and wisdom, often stayed near the fire a little longer. Partly because his experience made him useful, but mostly because lying down and getting up again felt like moving a mountain with a spoon. Arthritis doesn't play favorites not, even with the firekeeper. And when it was finally your turn to sleep, well, good luck. Resting in a room full of rustling animals, coughing family members, flapping window hides, and someone muttering in their dreams about turnips was less like sleep and more like light unconsciousness. There were always interruptions. Someone bumped you, a draft crept in, a goat sneezed directly onto your neck. Still, the rotation worked. Exhausting? Yes. Miserable? Definitely. But it was effective. It meant there were always cold, begrudging hands ready to poke the coals, adjust a log, or stop the hearth from dying out completely. As long as the embers lived, so did the family. So, next time you complain about waking up to let the dog out or tapping a thermostat from your smartphone, spare a thought for some peasant in Bramble Hollow at 3 a.m., squinting into a pile of ash and wondering if toes were truly necessary for a happy life. And that wasn't the only battlefield. You know it's bitterly cold when you have to think about how to breathe. That's right, breathing itself became a survival tactic. Taking a deep inhale through the mouth, that was a death sentence in training. Medieval villagers didn't just fight winter with layers and fires, they changed how they existed. Cold air rushing straight into the lungs could mean coughing, infections, and in many cases, pneumonia. And without doctors or medicine, unless you count boiled turnip tea and whispered prayers, you weren't coming back from that. So, peasants adopted a quiet, shallow style of breathing. Think of it as medieval breathwork. Inhale slowly, through the nose, in tiny sips, just enough to keep your blood pumping, but not enough to freeze your windpipe. The idea was to let your nose do the warming, turning frigid gusts into slightly less frigid gusts by the time they reached your chest. Children were taught early. No panting like a hound, mothers would scold, tugging cloaks tighter around their kids. You want to cough all winter? Little ones wrapped scarves around their faces until they looked like walking turnips with eyes. It wasn't stylish, but again, style didn't keep you alive. Some villagers even tied bits of cloth over their mouths as they slept. It caught the warmth of their breath and created a soggy little pocket of air just cozy enough to survive on. Yes, they woke up with clammy rags stuck to their faces, but they also woke up breathing, which in medieval terms was a win. Imagine it, lying on a bed of straw next to a steaming cow, under a blanket made of someone's old cloak, barely daring to inhale. It sounds awful, and it was. But it was the art of survival medieval yoga, if you will, only colder, and with more goats. Every breath was calculated, every movement deliberate. Winters weren't won by luck, they were endured, one shallow breath at a time. But while the cold assaulted the outside, medieval villagers discovered a secret weapon hiding in plain sight: dinner. Or more specifically, stuffing themselves silly before bed. That's right, when wool cloaks and shared body heat weren't enough, the answer was found in the belly. It's medieval science, really. The more your body digests, the warmer it gets. Calories meant internal heat, and so peasants made it a rule to never go to bed hungry in winter, not because of comfort, because of survival. Even in poor households, a warm meal before sleep was a priority. You weren't just feeding your body, you were fueling your night. The meals? Heavy, simple, and brown. Always brown. A thick stew made with whatever roots they had on hand turnips, onions, parsnips, some grains like barley or oats thrown in for texture. If the gods were generous or the neighbors clumsy, maybe a hunk of salted pork or sausage found its way into the pot. No one worried about plating or presentation. It was a bowl of warm sludge that settled in your stomach like a brickand. That brick worked all night, keeping your core warm. Fats were prized, not just because they were filling, but because fat burned slower than lean meat. That meant a longer-lasting internal fire. You could eat a greasy chunk of meat and still feel its warmth echoing in your ribs at dawn. In Bramble Hollow, a pot of fatty turnip stew was worth more than a pile of gold. Children weren't given options. Don't like turnips? Too bad. You ate them or you froze. Parenting was simple, efficient, and occasionally terrifying, but it worked. There were, of course, some side effects. Eating that much before bed made for some vivid dreams. Tales of villagers wrestling giant talking onions or floating on rivers of porridge were not uncommon. But were a few bizarre hallucinations worth it? Definitely, if it meant not waking up frozen, dream-on Cabbage River. And while food gave heat from the inside, peasants weren't done yet. Oh no, they got creative. You see, before electric blankets and preheated sheets, medieval villagers invented their own bedtime warmth hacks. The haybox and the holy grail of winter, comfort the heated stone. Let's start with the haybox. At first glance, it was just a wooden crate stuffed with hay. But this box had secrets. Food could be placed inside a hot pot of porridge or stewing. Thanks to the hay's insulating power, it stayed warm for hours. Like a medieval slow cooker, except you couldn't plug it in and it occasionally had bugs. But then, someone had a brilliant thought. If hay could trap the heat from food, could it trap heat from a rock? Enter the hot stone. Before bed, someone, usually the youngest, because life is cruel, was sent to pull a flat stone from the hearth fire. It had to be just right. Hot enough to radiate warmth, not hot enough to incinerate your bed. Once it was glowing, and your eyebrows were sweating from standing near it, the stone was wrapped in rags, cloth, or even old leather, then carefully tucked into a pot or jammed under the hay mattress. There it would sit, radiating life-saving heat for hours. Sometimes it went at the foot of the bed, sometimes under the hips, depending on whether you feared frostbite or wanted to keep your dreams spicy. There were risks, of course. Wrap it wrong, and congratulations, you've just lit your mattress on fire. Drop it on your foot? Welcome to a medieval fracture. But if you got it right, it was pure bliss. A hot stone under hay might not sound luxurious, but to those in Bramble Hollow, it was a miracle. You weren't just surviving, you were winning winter. And all of this, the haybox, the breathing hacks, the stews, the midnight shifts, the dirty layers, the sleeping strategies, they all orbited one sacred, smoky, temperamental family member. The hearth. It wasn't just a fireplace. It was the life center, the core, the pulse, the thing everyone worked for, sat around, and relied upon. Sleeping near it was an honor, a tactic, a necessity. Babies and elders got first dibs, their fragile bodies placed closest to the warmth. Around them, the rest of the family formed like layers of an onion. Older kids, parents, uncles, goats, everyone had their spot. And the closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up without frost forming in your hair. But sleeping too close was a gamble. Embers popped, sparks jumped. One wrong snore, and your cloak might catch fire. Too far, and your teeth would chatter themselves into dust. It was a nightly negotiation with the flame show. Close could you sleep without becoming dinner? Still, they managed, night after night, winter after winter. And every time the hearth was still glowing in the morning, they knew, we made it through one more night. Have you ever tried falling asleep in front of a fire, only to wake up with one side blissfully toasty and the other feeling like it's been cryogenically preserved? That was standard bedtime in Bramble Hollow. Because in medieval homes, warmth didn't distribute itself politely. It blasted the people sitting directly in front of the hearth while everyone else huddled on the edges, angling for heat like desperate lizards, scrambling into the single sunbeam, cutting through a stone wall. Get too close. And congratulations, you now had to explain to your neighbor why your sleeve was smoldering, or why your hair looked like it had been kissed by a campfire. Sit too far, and you might as well be sleeping outside next to a curious fox and a pile of regret. It was all about positioning. Face the fire, and you'd sleep with one side gloriously warm. Roll over, and the cold would slap you like a tax collector with a grudge. And it wasn't just humans fighting for fire real estate. Dogs wormed their way into prime territory, curling right up next to the coals with their tails wagging a little too close to open flame. Chickens perched on hearthstones, clucking judgmentally at anyone who dared try to move them. Even the occasional cat would appear from nowhere, staking claim to a glowing corner like it paid rent. Every snap of a log, every shift of glowing embers wasn't just ambiance, it was reassurance. You're alive. You're warm. For now. Outside that fragile radius of heat, the air was razor thin and unforgiving. Yet peasant Slepter tried to rocked into uneasy dreams by the crackle of burning wood, each breath forming misty ghosts in the air, like tiny smoke prayers drifting toward the thatched roof. It wasn't ideal, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life held together by the whisper of coals, a crowded room, and a thread of warmth just wide enough to keep hope breathing. But in this frostbitten theater, no one played their part alone. Surviving winter wasn't just a family effort, it was a village-wide performance where everyone, from the wrinkled elders to snot-nosed children, had a role. A fire could keep you alive. But when that fire failed, only the village could save you. When old Mira's chimney stopped smoking for a day, people noticed. Not out of nosiness, though, that helped, but because a house with no hearth smoke was a warning bell. Maybe she was out of fuel. Maybe she was sick. Or maybe the cold had won. Sometimes it was genuine concern. Other times, someone remembered that Mira still owed them a hen or had borrowed a cooking pot back in August. Either way, checking on her meant keeping the social and literal fire alive. Villages like Bramble Hollow operated on a kind of rugged kindness. Even if you didn't like your neighbor, you still made sure they were breathing come morning. There were unofficial winter watchers, usually old folks too stiff for fieldwork, or young ones not yet strong enough to haul firewood. They kept tabs, noticed who hadn't shown up to market, who wasn't coughing from their hut anymore, which was, paradoxically, worse, and who hadn't begged to borrow onions in 2 days. These were the medieval neighborhood patrolless high-vis jackets, more sheep, but just as vital. And if a fire did go out, that was a 4-alarm emergency. Someone might rush across the snow with a glowing coal wrapped in rags. Or better, they'd invite the affected family into their own crammed, smoky, damp hut for the night. Was there space? Not really, but survival didn't care about square footage. You squeezed in, made room, and hoped no one snored directly into your mouth. Communal food store-sacks of salted root vegetables, moldy grains, and maybe a bit of dried meat were pulled out during the worst stretches. It wasn't much, but a shared stew could mean the difference between dying quietly and hanging on until the thaw. Children delivered kindling, carried hot rocks, or ran messages through frostbitten paths. Even toddlers with runny noses understood what was at stake. And yes, villages weren't all peace and unity. There were old feudsome, going back generations over livestock, land boundaries, or stolen turnips. But come deep winter, grudges were shelved. Because even the most annoying neighbor might be your only lifeline in the cold. You saved them today. They might save you tomorrow. In the harshest months, the entire village became one enormous, dysfunctional family. Miserable, muddy, noisy, but undeniably connected by the shared battle to survive. Each shivering laugh, each shared ember, each whispered story beneath a shared blanket stitched them closer together. And for all their practical efforts, stuffing walls with moss, sharing food, banking fires, medieval peasants also leaned heavily into another resource: faith. Because when your walls were one step removed from paper and the wind screamed through them like it was auditioning for a ghost opera, you didn't just wear cloaks. You said prayers, lots of them. Before crawling under their itchy, slightly damp blankets, families would kneel by the fire, murmuring hasty pleas to anyone upstairs who might be listening. Keep the fire alive. Keep the roof from caving in. Keep the chickens from wandering off mid-blizzard. And above all, let us wake up with all our fingers. Saints weren't just religious symbols, they were winter defense units. Saint Beric was called upon to guard against frostbite, Saint Naima for respiratory troubles, and Saint Kellen, often pictured holding a shovel and a lantern, was invoked when you had to dig your way to the outhouse through 6 feet of snow. Some households sprinkled holy water near the hearth before bed, hoping it might keep evil spirits or sneaky drafts at bay. Others scrawled chalk marks on their doorframes after holy days, inviting warmth and luck to come inside. Candles, especially ones blessed by the local priest or that one terrifyingly devout old woman down the road, were lit and kept burning through the night. Flickering flames became nightly lighthouses against the creeping dark. And always, there were promises. Please, let us make it through this night, and I'll stop cursing at Aunt Letha. I'll even return her goat. Bargaining with the divine was part of the nightly routine, hope woven into desperation, flickering between soot-stained rafters. But despite their prayers, their effort, and their endurance, sometimes it wasn't enough. When winter struck hard and, it didn't just pick off a few unlucky souls. It swept through villages like a judgment. One of the worst was the brutal freeze of 1315, when endless rains rotted crops, livestock perished in the mud, and cold sank its claws into already starved families. It was slow, it was cruel, and it didn't care how many prayers you'd said the night before. Desperation led to dark choices. Tales tell of people boiling shoe leather, gnawing bark, and in the direst moments, turning on one another. It's hard to judge. When the fire dies, the cold isn't patient. Neighbors, come spring, would sometimes find entire homes silent, their roofs collapsed from snow, the family still inside, locked in a final embrace under frost. No food, no fire, just bodies piled together like they were still trying to warm each other, even in death. The hearth that once stood at the heart of every house? Cold, black, dead, not just a fireplace but a tombstone. Sometimes the house itself gave out. Roofs buckled under snow, walls cracked from ice, and the people inside simply didn't wake up. And when things were really bad, you might try stumbling through a storm to find help only to discover everyone else was already at the edge. The cold wasn't the only killer. Starvation weakened bodies. Overcrowded huts with smoke-choked lungs became perfect breeding grounds for diseases that needed no invitation. A cough in December could easily become a funeral in January. And frostbite? It took bits and pieces of people who lived. Fingers, toes, ears winter, claimed what it wanted. Survivors didn't just carry memories. They carried missing parts. Yet the most terrifying truth of all? This was normal, expected. Peasants didn't wonder if someone would die that winter, they wondered who. Death didn't knock. It let itself in and took a seat by the hearth. Still, through grief, loss, and frozen silence, medieval peasants endured. They didn't thrive. They persisted. Because as long as the fire still flickered, however weakly, and a single breath steamed the air, there was still something left worth fighting for. And when we look back at them now at Wolfgar, Ellen, little Alric, and the people of Bramble Hollow, it's tempting to only see the struggle, the cracked skin, the soot-stained cheeks, the endless gray of snow and ash. But buried beneath that dirt and smoke was something remarkable, a kind of stubborn brilliance that refused to die. They didn't have heating systems, or warm socks, or the option of giving up. But what they had, what they built, was a blueprint for human resilience. Every patch of moss in a wall, every ember banked in ash, every shared bowl of porridge was a victory, a refusal to give in. They didn't wait for spring. They dared winter to try harder. And somehow, against all odds, they won known smoky breath. One cracked smile, one glowing ember at a time. So go ahead, follow or subscribe the channel if you made it this far. And the next time you shiver when your heater's a little late to kick in, remember, someone, somewhere, once slept in a room full of chickens next to a fire made of sticks and pure willpower and called it home. The villagers of Bramble Hollow didn't survive brutal winters simply because they shared land. They survived because they shared everything's oop, wood, warmth, tears, and belief. They weren't just neighbors. They were co-conspirators in a desperate annual battle against the cold. They knew instinctively no one beat winter alone. They taught each other what mattered, how to check for a wheezing cough before it turned deadly, how to ration that last root vegetable, when to knock on a neighbor's door, not to borrow, but to help. Even children understood the code. You lend your ember today because next week someone might save your fire from dying. And through it all, beneath the frost and the fear, there was always something flickering beyond the flames. Hope, not the loud, dramatic kind, but quiet, stubborn, defiant hope, the kind that whispered, if we make it through tonight, maybe tomorrow will be warmer. It was that fragile strand of belief that held them together. They clung to it, whispering prayers into the smoky dark, not just out of fear, but from the unshakable conviction that spring would come, eventually, somehow. And when it did, the thaw wouldn't just melt snow, it would crack open possibility. Every time they patched a roof with reeds, banked the fire with ash, or crammed another body into a crowded hut, they were building something much bigger than survival. They were laying the bricks of the future, one frozen night at a time. And it worked, because of their endurance, because of every frostbitten knuckle, every whispered prayer, every bowl of shared stewie exist. The comfortable world we inhabit today was carved from their cold reality. Our electric blankets, our central heating, our hot chocolate by a roaring radiator, these weren't handed down from on high. They were earned. One crude tool, one stubborn ember, one prayer at a time. So when the wind howls against your well-insulated home and you draw your sweater a little tighter, maybe, just maybe, spare a thought for the nameless survivors of those medieval winters. For the ones who turned misery into memory, who built a legacy not from grandeur, but grit. One breath, one spark, one heartbeat that refused to give up. And now, a different ember begins to burn. Far from the frozen huts and hay-packed beds of Bramble Hollow, a girl was born not in straw or soot, but in the gilded uncertainty of the English nobility. Her name was Anne. Anne Baradon didn't enter the world draped in silk or crowned by destiny. Around 1501, she arrived in either Whitethorn Manor or Harriswick Holocounts, very born to Thomas Baradon, an ambitious court diplomat, and Lady Elsbeth of House Harwood, a woman born of power but raised on discipline. Anne's birth caused no great stir. No prophecies followed her, and yet history had already begun to inch its gaze in her direction. From the start, Anne was different, not for her beauty, which was considered unconventional even by generous standards, but for her mind. Sharp, quick, magnetic. She didn't have to try to capture a room, she tilted it. Recognizing her potential, her family did something rare. They invested in it. Anne was sent abroad, first to the polished court of Duchess Marguerite of Brabant, where she learned diplomacy not from books, but from whispers passed over wine goblets and laughter veiled in fan flutters. She absorbed language like breath, learned grace like muscle memory, and developed a social cunning that would one day terrify even kings. But it was in France, in the glittering court of Queen Claude and the bold Queen Marguerite of Navarre, where Anne truly transformed. Here, amid poets and politics, she refined her instincts. Where other girls embroidered linen, Anne embroidered reputation. Her words were precise, her presence unforgettable. She learned how to smile without yielding, to flirt without surrender, and most of all, how to listen when others underestimated her. By the time Anne returned to England in the early 1520s, she was no longer a nobleman's daughter, she was a woman forged in continental fire. She wasn't considered a classic beauty, but what she had was more powerful. Intelligence that sparked behind dark, calculating eyes, a lyrical voice that danced between mockery and command, and a walk that dared anyone to stand in her way. She didn't just enter rooms, she redefined them. Anne wasn't born to power, but she understood it. She'd seen it behind lace veils and courtly charades. And now, standing in the echoing halls of the English court, she was ready to claim her place whatever the cost. And so, the storm began. When Anne Baradon returned to court, she didn't float in like a soft English rose. She arrived like thunder, loud, electric, unforgettable. Amid the pale, soft-spoken ladies of King Henry's court, Anne was a bolt of color, wit, and unsettling self-possession. She first took her place as maid of honor to Queen Catalina, dutiful, quiet, ever observant, but it didn't take long before whispers coiled around her name like ivy. "That Baradon girl," they murmured. "Have you seen the way she speaks? The way the men listen?" She danced like she was born to music, spoke French like a second skin, and laughed like she had nothing to fear. Men noticed. Women gossiped. The court shifted, ever so slightly, toward her gravity. Then, The most dangerous man in the kingdom noticed too. King Henry VIII was used to conquest in battlefields and in bedrooms. The court was his hunting ground, its women dear he could charm, corner, and claim. But Anne didn't flinch, she didn't swoon. She refused. That refusal lit a fire Henry couldn't smother. He pursued. She eluded. He wrote letters thick with desperation and desire. Anne answered with precision, baiting without yielding, flattering without falling. When he offered her the role of royal mistress of position, both powerful and perilous, declined. She didn't want to be a mistress. She wanted to be queen. It was madness. Henry was married. His wife, Queen Catalina, had been by his side for over 20 years. She was beloved, respected, protected by the Holy Roman Emperor himself. To replace her wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. But Anne had learned in France, power, real power, was never given. It was taken, carefully, boldly, completely. So she played the long game, carefully, ruthlessly. And as Henry's obsession deepened, Anne's bet became a national crisis. Henry rewrote the story of his marriage to Catalina. He insisted it had been cursed from the start because she had once been married to his brother. Never mind the papal dispensation that allowed it. Never mind decades of loyalty and children. Now, he said, his soul was damned. Anne watched carefully, calculatingly from just beyond reach. She kept his hope alive, never quite yielding, never quite disappearing. Her every move was a gamble, her every glance a strategy. The court fractured. Nobles chose sides. Some saw Anne as the future and rushed to flatter her. Others clung to Catalina, horrified at the scandal. Foreign kings hissed threats. Rome seethed. And still Anne stood, unmoving, eyes locked on the crown. Years passed, 7 of them, and in January 1533, Anne Baradon won. She and Henry were married in secret, though in the eyes of Rome, his first marriage still stood. In June, she was crowned Queen of England in a ceremony meant to dazzle, to legitimize, to declare her power to the world. It should have been her triumph. But even as she stood crowned in Westminster Abbey, the crowd outside didn't cheer, they watched in silence. The people still loved Catalina. The church was cracking apart. And Anne, despite her crown, had just become the most controversial woman in England. And still, she stood tall. A woman who dared to say no to a king. A woman who forced the throne to shift for her. A woman who had once been a clever girl at the edge of power, now gripping it with both hands. Her victory was bold, but as history would soon show it, was also perilous. Anne Baradon stepped out as queen beneath gray skies and weary stares. Some in the crowd murmured blessings under their breath. Others whispered prayers for Queen Catalina, the woman they still believed wore the true crown. And many simply watched in silence, unsure whether this daring, foreign-educated noblewoman was England's future or its undoing. From her first moment on the throne, Anne was not embraced, she was endured. Unlike the familiar gentleness of Queen Catalina, Anne was fire wrapped in silk. She favored bold colors and bold words. She spoke her mind with the same ease she spoke French. She wielded influence like a blade and made enemies with stunning speed. Her queenship was dazzling, yes, but it was also fragile. For all her intellect, all her ambition, all the battles she had won, Anne knew this one truth more clearly than anyone. Her place, her future, her entire life as queen depended on one thing: producing a male heir. It was the unspoken pact. Henry had torn his country apart to marry her. Now she had to deliver the prince who would secure his legacy. At first, it all seemed promising. Anne and Henry rejoiced together when her belly began to swell. The court held its breath, certain the child would be a boy. But in September of 1533, Anne gave birth not to a prince, but to a princess. She named her Elizabeth. Anne presented her daughter with grace and pride, never allowing her inner devastation to surface. She insisted that the next child would be a son, that Elizabeth's birth was a prelude, not a failure. But Henry's disappointment was obvious, flickering behind his gaze like a dying ember. Still, Anne remained the court's brightest star, at least for a time. She reshaped its culture to reflect her ideals. She lifted her relatives to new heights, placing the Baradon name alongside the noblest in the land. She became the first queen, crowned with the sacred oil typically reserved for monarchs. A bold signal that she was not merely Henry's consort, she was his chosen queen. Her influence rippled beyond gowns and gossip. Diplomats bent their ears to her whispers. Political decisions bore her fingerprints. She was no silent ornament, she was power, personified. And in the name of that power, Henry did what had once seemed unthinkable. He severed England from Rome. The creation of the Church of England, with the king at its helm, was not simply religious reform, it was Anne's crown forged into law. But even as she stood at the peak of her influence, shadows began to stretch across her world. Whispered doubts, shifting loyalties, and the slow, chilling realization that Henry, ever capricious, was beginning to turn his gaze elsewhere. Anne had won the crown, but she was beginning to lose the man who placed it on her head. The pressure to give Henry a son only grew. Elizabeth, bright and beautiful as she was, remained the wrong gender in the eyes of dynastic expectation. Anne endured several pregnancies in rapid succession, each one ending in tragedy. Miscarriages drained her strength and her spirit. The court, once breathless with her ambition, began to exchange knowing looks and quiet condolences. Henry, once enchanted by her fire, grew impatient with her flame. The qualities that had once lured him, her wit, her sharpness, her refusal to bow, now grated against his pride. He wanted calm. He wanted obedience. He wanted something Anne could never be. Outside their chambers, her rivals circled like wolves. The old supporters of Queen Catalina had never forgiven Anne for what they saw as blasphemy. Many nobles who had tolerated her rise now openly hoped for her fall. Even the commoners, once curious, now muttered that the king's second wife had brought nothing but turmoil and schism. Then came Jane Seymour. Soft-spoken, compliant, everything Anne was not. Where Anne had dazzled, Jane demurred. Where Anne had challenged, Jane yielded. She became Henry's new fixation. Anne saw it. She knew what it meant. She tried to reclaim her place, offering her husband affection, redoubled devotion, the promise of more sons. But the tide was shifting, and Henry's heart, once a wildfire, had turned to ice. And in that cold, Thomas Crowhurst Cromwell to the court-sensed opportunity. He had once stood beside Anne, championing her ascent, aligning with her vision. But ambition is a currency, and Anne's was no longer useful. She had become unpredictable. And worse, she threatened Crowhurst's careful plans. She pushed for reforms to benefit the common folk. She threatened the wealth of nobles who filled the royal coffers. It was dangerous. And in the game of survival, Crowhurst chose self-preservation. Henry, growing restless, didn't need a divorce. He needed an excuse, a clean one, a damning one. Crowhurst delivered. The accusations were grotesque: treason, adultery, incest. The Queen, once England's brightest light, was painted as a villain, a seductress, a traitor. Behind closed doors, Crowhurst assembled confessions, real or coerced. Courtiers who had once flirted in Anne's presence were dragged into interrogation rooms and twisted into traitors. Even her brother, Lord George Baradon, was arrested. Lies became testimony. Jokes became evidence. Truth no longer mattered the verdict. Anne, recognizing the trap too late, fought to survive. She appealed to Henry's memory, to their daughter, to their shared past. But the king, once moved to tears for her, refused to see her. She was no longer his queen. She was an inconvenience to be erased. On a cold morning in May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The gates shut behind her with the finality of a tomb. The woman who had changed England stood now not as queen, but as prisoner. The halls that once echoed with her laughter now held only her footfalls, heavy with dread. She was no longer the king's chosen. She was a pawn in a story no longer hers to tell. Days later, she was led into the tower's great hall to face trial. The tribunal of nobles that awaited her had once cheered her ascent. Some owed her their lands, their titles. Now they sat in judgment, expressionless. Their silence spoke louder than any gavel. The charges were absurd. Multiple affairs, treasonous plots, incest, each one more unbelievable than the last. In another world, the accusations would have been laughed out of court. But this was not justice, it was theater, a performance staged for Henry's conscience and the kingdom's quiet compliance. Anne stood her ground with the same intellect and poise that once captured a king. She answered every charge, clearly, forcefully. She reminded them that she had been chosen, crowned, anointed not just by Henry, but before God. She invoked her loyalty, her service, her sacrifices. But no defense could stop what had already begun. The verdict had been decided long before she entered the room. Anne Baradon's fall was not a trial. It was a ritual-lone final act in the transformation of a queen into a warning. As the sentence was passed, her enemies did not cheer. They simply nodded. They had seen power fall before, but rarely had it fallen from such a height, with such brilliance. Anne was returned to her cell to await the inevitable. She had changed the course of English history. She had reshaped the throne, the church, and the very idea of royal power. But in the end, she was still a woman in a man's world, and the game she had played so well had finally consumed her. She had risen like fire, and now the ashes awaited. But her story was not yet done. Not entirely, because beyond the walls of the tower, beyond the whispers and the knives and the silence, there was still one ember left. A child, a daughter, a girl named Elizabeth. And from Anne's ruin, a new flame would rise. It wasn't thunder that echoed through the Tower of Lawndale that day. It was the silence after a storm, a hush so complete that even the guards stood straighter, unsure if history itself had paused to bear witness. Anne Baradonancy, Queen, once flame, once the very axis around which a nation had spun, stood in the dim courtroom like a monument to defiance. Her hands were still, her eyes cool and unwavering. And the verdict that followed, it landed not like a dagger but like a funeral bell, tolling in grim finality. Guilty of treason, of adultery, of sins no crown could shield her from. The evidence had been stitched together with trembling hands and eager whispers, barely believable, clearly contradictory. Dates clashed. Names shifted. Testimonies reeked of coercion. Yet truth had long since left the building. The trial wasn't about justice. It was a ritual, a cleansing, a symbolic purging of a woman who had risen too far, too fast. Her brother, Lord George Baradon, and the other men named in this grand theater of betrayal received the same fate, death. But Anne's end would be dressed in what the court dared call mercy. No ropes, no drawn entrails. Beheading, clean, efficient, regal. As the judgment echoed across the vaulted chamber, Anne didn't flinch. Her face, pale with the dignity of defeat, remained serene. The fierce woman who had once ruled a court with her wit and willpower now stood prepared for the blade. She offered no screams, no begging, no denial. Just a calm, measured statement. She was ready to meet death, and she prayed for grace not just for herself, but for the kingdom, for her daughter. And then she turned, her skirts whispering against the cold stone, and disappeared back into the tower. Behind her, nobles exhaled. The drama was nearly done. The storm had passed, or so they thought. What they failed to see, what history would later understand, was that they were not erasing Anne Baradon. They were transforming her into something far more dangerous than a queen. They were immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. Inside the tower's heavy walls, Anne was no longer queen. She was prisoner. But even then, she would not surrender her fire. Her final days were not filled with rage or desperation. They were filled with poise, with prayer, with something deeper than defiance, acceptance, yes, but also a kind of sacred control over her last chapter. She spent long hours kneeling on cold floors, her hands folded tightly, her whispered prayers rising like steam into the damp air. Her words weren't confessions. She held fast to her innocence. Not because she feared death, but because she believed she had done nothing to deserve it. To her few loyal ladies who stayed by her side, Anne was not the broken woman they had expected. She comforted them. She told jokes with a bitter twist, even referring to herself with a wry smile as the queen who lost her head. Her dark humor was a last flicker of the sharpness that once reigned in Henry's court. Henry himself showed no such grace. He had already moved on. Long before Anne's execution date was even confirmed, he was deep in preparations for his next marriage to Jane Seymour, the gentle-faced shadow who had slipped into Anne's place with barely a sound. For Anne, the knowledge must have cut deeper than the sword that awaited her, that the man who once declared he would move heaven and earth for her had now cast her aside like a pawn removed from play, that his passion, once volcanic, had turned to ash. On the evening of May 18th, 1536, Anne was told she would die the following morning. She didn't sleep. Instead, she prayed. She asked not for a miracle, but for mercy. For her daughter, Elizabeth Just, a toddler, for the kingdom that had torn itself in two over her marriage. And perhaps, in the dark silence of her chamber, she prayed for herself, for the ambition that had lifted her so high, for the pride that refused to bend. To Henry's slight creditor, perhaps out of guilt disguised as royal decorum, he had sent for a French swordsman, reputedly swift and precise. The blade would be cleaner than the executioner's axe, more dignified, less messy. A small gesture, perhaps meant to soothe his conscience more than Anne's final moments. When the first pale light of dawn crept into the tower on May 19th, Anne rose and dressed with deliberate care. Her gown was a rich gray damask, lined with Fura Queen's attire even at the gallows. Beneath, a crimson kirtle peeked through, blood-red and resolute. She pinned up her hair, hidden now beneath a plain linen cap, her crown long vanished, but her bearing undiminished. She walked into the courtyard not as a prisoner, but as a woman walking to her fate with eyes wide open. Mist curled low around the cobblestones. The air was thick with tension, yet she moved with astonishing calm. No sobbing, no desperate pleas, just dignity, as if she intended to meet the sword like a long-awaited guest. The crowd gathered to witness, some with morbid curiosity, others in mourning. Even among those who had resented her, the hush that followed her arrival was not born of hate, was awe. There was something in the way she stood, shoulders squared, face lifted, that dared them to look away. Anne Baradon, once queen, now condemned, spoke softly but clearly. She did not rail against injustice. She did not name her betrayers. Instead, she asked those present to pray for her soul. She forgave. She bowed to the judgment of God, not man. And she declared still with that unwavering clarity that she died loyal to the king. Then she knelt, and in one swift stroke, the blade fell. There was no scream, just silence. A silence that thundered louder than applause. Anne's body was placed in an arrow chest, hastily chosen in lieu of a coffin, and buried in the chapel beside others lost to Henry's whims. But if the king thought that was the end of her, that she would be forgotten beneath stone and shame, he was wrong. Anne's death became legend almost as swiftly as it became history. Songs, poems, whispers in courts across Europe spoke of the queen who had dared too much, risen too far, and fallen too hard. But more powerful than any tale was the life she left behind. A daughter, Elizabeth. A child born in disappointment, raised under suspicion, but destined, in time, to wear a crown more formidable than either of her parents could have imagined. Anne had not died for nothing. She had changed England. She had redefined queenship. And through her daughter, she would one day redefine monarchy itself. The sword had claimed her body, but it could not claim her legacy. And that more than any jewel, any title, any crown, was what made Anne Baradon immortal. Not every queen dies with her crown still glinting in the sun. Some meet their end beneath the shadow of stone walls and the steel of silence. On a cold morning, in May of 1536, a woman who once set kingdoms ablaze with ambition stepped barefoot onto the execution scaffold, her breath curling like ghosts in the air. Aline Baratante, fiery queen who defied a dynasty, rewrote the rules of royalty and brought an empire to its knees, was about to meet her final chapter. She climbed the wooden steps not as a prisoner, not as a victim, but as a figure of quiet defiance wrapped in dignity. Every eye in that courtyard was locked on her, but no one dared to speak. Even the wind held its breath. Those gatheredas scattering of courtiers, guards, and a few carefully selected witnesses watched in unnerving silence. The only sound was the soft flutter of Aline's gray dress against the chill breeze. Once resplendent in gold-trimmed gowns, she now wore somber silk edged with fur, a queen's quiet farewell to the world. Her face, thinner than it had been at court, was ghostly pale. And yet there was no panic in her eyes, no breakdown, no wailing pleas, just a strange, resolute calm. It was the kind of calm that unnerved even her enemies. She stood tall, poised. Even in death, she refused to bow. Her final words were brief, spoken with care, her voice soft yet cutting through the cold like a blade of its own. She did not rage against injustice. She did not curse the man who had sentenced her. No accusations, no bitterness. Instead, Aline Baraton prayed. She offered blessings for the health of the very king who had once vowed to move mountains for her and then tossed her aside like a worn-out crown. Her final gift to the world wasn't rage, but forgiveness. And in that forgiveness, she stunned the crowd. Even those who had come to watch her downfall, the curious, the loyal, the treacherous, were shaken. The executioner, a specialist summoned from abroad, approached quietly. He had been chosen for his precision, for the promise of a death that would be fast and clean. As he readied his blade, Aline knelt with grace, her hands folded in prayer, her head bowed not in defeat, but in surrender to the inevitable. A white cloth was gently tied over her eyes. She did not flinch, she did not tremble. Then, one flash of steel. No scream, no echo, just a single movement, silent, swift, absolute. And then, Aline Baraton, queen, mother, survivor, was gone. There was no ceremony, no parade of mourning. She was buried swiftly within the tower walls, without even a proper casket. Her remains were placed in a discarded arrow chest, as if her legacy could be packed away just as easily. No headstone marked the spot. The queen who once wore a golden crown was left to vanish in the silence of a damp stone grave. But they underestimated her. Because Aline's story did not end with that blade, it had only just begun. From the bloodline she left behind, a fire still smoldered, a child, a daughter born beneath disappointment and doubt, but destined to burn brighter than them all. That child would become the queen who ruled not from the edge of scandal, but from the height of golden power. Illyra I, later known as the Virgin Monarch of Eldridge, would rise from her mother's ashes and lead an empire into its most iconic age. Illyra bore her mother's sharp mind, her keen eyes, and the steel-spined resilience that no crown alone could offer. She inherited the fire of Aline's will, the intelligence that once disarmed a king, and the same unshakable understanding that survival was not enough. Impact was the true legacy. And impact was something Aline Baraton delivered in full. She helped sever a kingdom from the authority of Rome. Her influence catalyzed the creation of the sacred dominion, the new faith of Eldridge, and in doing so, redefined what monarchy even meant. She showed the world that queens were not simply wives, ornaments, or royal wombs. They were power. Her death served as a warning to others, yet her legacy, carried in the blood and brilliance of Illyra, transformed into inspiration. Aline was more than a footnote, more than a scandal, more than the woman who lost her head. She became a symbol of audacity, of brilliance, of a fire that refused to die, even in death. The sword may have ended her life, but it could not erase her name. History would write her as many things: a temptress, a traitor, a tragedy. But over time, the ink would fade on those labels. What remained, what endured, was the undeniable truth that she changed the fate of a kingdom, not through battles or borders, but through influence, through intelligence, through daring to rise where no one expected her to, and to burn where no one thought a woman could. And from that fire, her daughter would rise undaunted, unbent, and unforgettable. Olene's enemies had tried to bury her without ceremony, without honor, without memory. But you cannot bury a legend. Not really. So, the next time you stare into the mirror and wonder what it means to rise when the world tells you to stay down, remember her. The queen who faced betrayal with silence, faced death with grace, and left behind not just a child but a kingdom forever altered by her presence. She may have lost her life, but in the end, Olene Brereton won immortality. Follow or subscribe the channel for more powerful stories like this, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about who dared to make it happen. It didn't begin with a war cry. It started with tea leaves and Tax's quiet, brittle things that would shatter an empire. And long before the first musket fired, before the stars and stripes ever waved, America was already seething beneath the surface. The year was 1773, and the American colonies were like a rope pulled too tight for too long, ready to snap. What started as murmurs of protest had grown into a thunderous defiance. For over a decade, colonists had begged, reasoned, demanded that Parliament listen, and sometimes they did. The Stamp Act? Repealed after fiery protest. Other taxes? Withdrawn begrudgingly. But every step back from London was followed by 2 steps forward, a fresh tax, a new insult, a deeper wound. This wasn't about money. Not really. The taxes were modest mere pennies by British standards. But to the colonists, every coin was a slap in the face. It was about dignity, about consent. They weren't citizens anymore. They were being ruled like property subjects of a distant empire that treated them like a forgotten appendage. And no city felt the sting more than Bristol, bustling harbor town that would become the epicenter of rebellion. Braston became the lungs of resistance, and its heartbeat? A secret society known as the Coal Fire Pact, a group of defiant merchants, printers, and blacksmiths who saw injustice and swore not to go quietly. They didn't march in uniforms or hold office. They met in shadowy corners, in basements lit by candlelight, whispering revolution. Their words burned hotter than muskets ever could. In 1770, the pressure finally exploded. Red-coated British soldiers, stationed in the colony to keep peace, opened fire on a group of unarmed civilians after a street confrontation spiraled out of control. Blood stained Braston's cobblestones. The massacre turned tension into outrage, and any illusion of trust evaporated into the cold night air. Still, the colonists held back. They clung to hope like a sinking ship to driftwood, hope that diplomacy might work, that England would come to its senses. But in late 1773, it wasn't a cannon blast or a march of soldiers that broke the colonies. It was tea. Crates of it, stacked neatly, imported through imperial channels, and pushed as a gift, cheaper, fresher, better. It was supposed to be a sweetener. Parliament thought, foolishly, that if they made the product too cheap to resist, the colonists would abandon their principles and drink their grievances away. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't about tea. It was about chains, and no discount could make a man love his shackles. The Leaf Mandatillas, it was renamed, in colonial pamphlets was Parliament's latest sleight of hand. Officially, it aimed to save the floundering Royal East Trade Company by allowing it to sell directly to colonists. The middlemen were cut out, the prices slashed. A luxury beverage, available at a bargain price. On paper, it was genius. In reality, it was the final insult. The tax on tea still remained, and accepting the cheaper tea meant accepting Britain's right to tax the colonies without their say. For men and women who had been shouting, "No consent, no coin," for over 10 years, it was a betrayal, a silent surrender, and the colonists weren't about to yield. Word of the Tea Act lit the colonies like dry fields in a lightning storm. In Braston, rallies were held under the cover of dusk. In taverns, protest songs drowned out fiddle tunes. In coastal cities, dock workers and shopkeepers gathered by the hundreds, promising they would not touch a drop. This wasn't just about losing business. It was about losing autonomy. Local merchants especially saw the writing on the wall. If one company could sell tea this way, what else could be stripped from them next? Glass, paper, salt? Their livelihoods, whittled away by London with every new law dressed up as opportunity. One merchant, Caleb Fenwick, stood atop a rum barrel in the Braston marketplace and shouted, "Today it's tea. Tomorrow it's the breath in your chest. We pay for it. We bleed for it." And they laugh at us for complaining. Fenwick's speech became legend. Printed in underground newspapers, read aloud in city squares, whispered into the ears of children. The colonies weren't asking anymore. They were warning. And Parliament? They weren't listening. They believed the colonies would calm down, that eventually Americans would tire of shouting. They underestimated the pride of a people who had spent generations carving lives from wilderness, from storms, from hunger. They were not soft. They were not loyal pets waiting for a pat on the head. They were on the edge. As the first shipments of taxed tea arrived in colonial ports, tempers boiled over. In Braston, the Coal Fire Pact began meeting every night. They watched the docks. They tracked loyalist merchants. And they waited for the right moment. It came one bitter evening in December, as 3 British ships sat in Braston Harbor, heavy with tea chests. The ships had arrived under the protection of British guards, who watched the crates as if they were gold. No one dared unload them. No one dared touch them. Until someone did. It started with footsteps, dozens of them, then hundreds. Cloaked men, faces painted like warriors, descended upon the harbor. They said nothing. They marched in silence. And without uttering a single word, they boarded the ships. One by one, the crates were ripped open and hurled into the freezing sea. Not stolen, not smuggled, destroyed. Every splash was a declaration louder than cannon fire. Every crate cracked open was a line in a declaration of defiance. It wasn't about the tea. It was about the chains the tea represented. By dawn, the water in Braston Harbor was steeped in rebellion, and the world was about to change forever. The British Crown reacted with fury. Parliament passed what colonists would call the Iron Access series of laws meant to crush the rebellion under an iron heel. Ports were closed. Colonial self-government was suspended. Soldiers were housed in private homes without consent. But the damage was done. The tea had sunk, and with it, any hope of reconciliation. The American colonies, once bound to England by trade, history, and blood, had severed the rope with a single icy plunge. There would be no going back now. Follow or subscribe the channel, because what happened next wasn't just history. It was the spark that set an entire revolution on fire. You can only slap a lion so many times before it bites back. And in the winter of 1773, the British Crown didn't just slap, they tried to sell the lion a cup of tea with a smirk. Boston wasn't amused. Across the Atlantic, Parliament thought they were being clever, offering colonists cheaper tea, like tossing breadcrumbs to calm a mob. But in the alleys and meeting halls of Dunmore, the port town at the heart of colonial resistance, the offer wasn't seen as kindness. It was bait cheaply wrapped in trade law, dripping with arrogance. The Crown still believed it could rule by decree. The people of Dunmore believed otherwise. The Ashfire Accord, Dunmore's underground network of tradesmen, thinkers, and loud-mouthed patriots, roared with fury at the latest insult. The so-called Leaf Mandatia law cloaked in savings, but soaked in tyranny. To them, accepting the discounted tea meant kneeling to imperial authority. It wasn't about beverages anymore. It was about backbone. Public squares buzzed with outrage. Churches that once hummed with psalms now thundered with sermons condemning royal greed. Tavern signs swapped drink specials for protest slogans. In print shops, Ink-stained fingers furiously typeset headlines that scorched the eyes, "No tea, no chains," and "Liberty brews without tyranny." In the heart of the storm stood the firebrand Silas Wren, a silver-tongued printer who published daily columns of satirical fury, and Reese Calder, a former merchant turned rebel strategist who could organize a protest in the time it took to boil water. And then there was Mara Kinley, a brewer's daughter who turned her father's tavern into a planning headquarters. It was said she could spit hotter truths than any torch in town. These weren't soldiers. They were farmers, tradesmen, printers, blacksmiths, but their resolve was sharper than any bayonet. From colonies north to south, merchant ports began closing their doors to the East Empire Company. Ships carrying the cursed crates were denied docking. In New Vale, dock workers lined the harbor and refused to unload a single barrel. In South Marsh, tea was thrown overboard before it ever touched colonial soil. But Dunmore's fate twisted differently. 3 British merchant ships, the Windspire, the Marigold, and the Cinderland, arrived at the harbor under full escort. They dropped anchor in the dead of night and sat there, motionless, like wolves at the edge of a pasture. Their orders were clear. The tea must be unloaded, and the tax must be paid. But Dunmore wasn't interested in orders. Royal officials, smug in their authority, demanded that the crates be processed. The locals said no. The Ashfire Accord, backed by a growing sea of angry citizens, vowed that not a single leaf would touch colonial ground. Days passed, then a week. The ships remained like rotting thorns in the harbor, and the city, already smoldering from years of tension, became something else, primed, loaded, and ready to erupt. The harbor standoff, as it came to be known, wasn't marked by bloodshed yet, but each hour added weight to a moment the city could feel barreling toward them like thunder. Debates turned to shouts. Friends turned into agitators. Even children whispered about the crates and the countdown. In the old wooden hall of Lanthorn House, a series of public assemblies grew larger by the night. At first, dozens gathered, then hundreds. Soon, thousands packed the chamber, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath sagging rafters and smoky lanterns. There, resolutions were shouted, hands raised, voices trembling with urgency. They weren't arguing over tax rates anymore, they were fighting for the soul of their future. At the podium, Mara Kinley stood on a cider barrel and raised her voice like a war drum. "They think we'll sip and smile. That we'll thank them for the leash. But we've had enough. No tea, no tyranny, no more." Her words cracked through the crowd like lightning. Fists rose. So did hearts. Silas Wren followed with a more cunning tone. "Tea is just the start. Today they drop crates. Tomorrow, soldiers. Then gallows. Mark me, friends, we stop them at the dock, or we meet them at the noose." The crowd roared. The Ashfire Accord distributed printed instructions to every district, calling for a citywide boycott. No storage, no sale, no acceptance. Anyone caught unloading the cargo would be branded a traitor to the cause. But the clock was ticking. British trade law decreed that once a ship docked with taxable cargo, it had 20 days to unload her. The customs office could seize it, enforce the tax, and deliver the profit straight to the crown. That deadline, for Dunmore, was days away. If the cargo remained after the 20th day, officials could summon redcoats to guard it and force collection. The tea would enter the colony by law, by musket, or by violence. The Ashfire Accord knew they couldn't let that happen. Not only would it be a symbolic defeat, it would open the floodgates for more oppression. If the tea tax passed under protest, it would set the precedent that Parliament could impose whatever they wished and expect quiet obedience. "No one bows quietly with a boot on their neck," Mara said in one meeting. "Not here. Not now. Not ever." As the final day neared, Dunmore held its collective breath. Families lit fewer candles at night, saving wax for emergencies. Shopkeepers posted "Closed for Liberty" signs on their doors. Blacksmiths forged more than horseshoes iron poles, nail-studded staves, anything that could become a weapon. In churches, Preachers delivered sermons not just about God, but about justice. "We are made free not just in spirit, but in law," thundered Reverend Halverton. "Let no man sell you for a shilling of tea." The morning of the 20th day dawned gray and cold. The harbor lay still, its ships watching the town like sentinels. British customs agents stood ready with ink-stained quills and eager hands. But inside Dunmore's heart, a plan was set. Not through speeches, not through signatures, through action. What happened that night would become legend. Dozens of colonists, their faces darkened with soot and ash, disguised themselves as native warriors, not to mock, but to signal a break from the empire that no longer ruled them. Carrying axes, crowbars, and iron hooks, they marched without a sound toward the harbor. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't a looting. It was a sentence. One by one, they boarded the Windspire, then the Marigold, then the Cinderlane. No British soldier raised a hand to stop them. The crowd on shore stood silent. Mothers held their children. Dock workers lowered their heads in prayer. Then came the splashes. Crate after crate was torn open and hurled into the sea. Green leaves floated like strange flowers in the tide, sinking slowly beneath the waves. No cargo was kept. No merchant dared profit. It was not theft. It was cleansing. And when the last crate was gone, the masked figures vanished into the dark. By dawn, the harbor water was stained a deep swirling brown. The air smelled of salt, defiance, and something new: freedom. The British crown would rage. Punishments would come. But the colony of Dunmore had drawn a line too clear to ignore. It wasn't about the tea. It was about the message burned into the hearts of every man and woman who watched those crates fall. We will not be ruled. Not by force. Not by trade. Not anymore. Follow or subscribe the channel, because the moment the tea sank, the revolution began to rise. You could almost taste it in the air rebellion. Not the loud, clanging kind with swords and battle cries. No, this was quieter, icy, brewing, like a frozen fuse just waiting for the match. By late December 1773, the city of Eastvale was boiling beneath its snow-crusted surface. Governor Trent Hollingsworth, a proud royalist with a chin permanently lifted in defiance, had refused every plea. He would not let the British tea ships leave without unloading their cargo. Not because he loved tea, but because retreat, to him, meant admitting the people ruled the colony instead of the crown. "Order comes from above," he told his advisors. "Mob rule is for animals, not citizens." Eastvale, though, was done with polite obedience. From every cobbled street and frosted window came the same cold reply: "Then call us beasts." The standoff had turned into theater, and the entire colony was watching. For nearly 3 weeks, 3 tea-laden ships, the Iron Marlin, the Drake's Hollow, and the Peregrine, loomed in the harbor like bloated warnings. The law was clear. If the tea wasn't unloaded by day 20, customs agents could seize it. Worse, redcoats could be summoned to enforce the collection by blade or bayonet. The colonists weren't just fighting over tea anymore. They were fighting over dignity, over sovereignty. If they allowed even a single crate to cross that dock, everything they'd argued for: representation, self-rule, liberty, would unravel like twine in a storm. And so, December 16th dawned gray and grim, the kind of sky that makes even fire feel cold. From dawn onward, the people came. Some trudged miles through snow-choked paths. Others rode in on creaking carts. By mid-morning, the Lantern Hall, Eastvale's largest public meeting house, was bursting at the seams. Thousands pressed in, elbow to elbow, the breath of the crowd clouding the air like smoke. At the pulpit stood Elias Dorn, scholar-turned-rebel voice, flanked by other stalwarts of the resistance. Willa Mercer, once a quiet candlemaker, now a loud and uncompromising voice in the rebellion, stood among them, her fingers ink-stained from writing protest flyers night after night. The speeches thundered. One by one, leaders took the floor, their voices slicing through the fog of fear. No more taxes disguised as gifts. We are not subjects, we are people. Will we trade freedom for cheaper tea? But, for all the fire, Uncertainty still gnawed at the edges. Could they stop the tea without starting a war? Could they act without inviting total ruin? And then the news arrived, like a hammer blow to the chest. A rider, pale from the cold and the weight of the message, burst through the doors. Governor Hollingsworth had held firm. The ships would not leave. The tea would be unloaded. The tax would be enforced. Troops would be summoned. The hall fell into a stunned silence. That was it. The 20 days were up. The deadline had passed. There would be no more petitions, no more polite refusals. It was now or never. And Elias Dorn, who had once taught Latin in a college and now stood at the edge of insurrection, simply said, "This gathering can do nothing more to save the colony." It was a sentence plain and steady, but everyone in the room understood it for what it was. The end of talk, the beginning of history. Outside, the city held its breath. Then came the signal, a sharp, high-pitched cry that cut through the alleyways and rooftops like a blade, the call of action, of uprising, of rebellion. A chorus of war cries answered it from the shadows, not from soldiers, but from blacksmiths, brewers, farmers, tanners, ordinary folk, suddenly cloaked in something extraordinary. They moved quickly, donning rough cloaks and soot-smeared faces, adorned with feathers and stitched scraps of cloth. It wasn't a disguise to fool, it was a symbol, an emblem of transformation, of casting off empire and becoming something new, something free. As the sun vanished behind East Vale's iron rooftops, figures emerged from every alley and stable yard. Not soldier citizens, not thugs patriots. Their boots thudded over frozen dirt paths toward the harbor, not in a stampede but in a procession. Each step whispered the same thing: enough. The ships loomed ahead, their black silhouettes stark against the pale sky. No resistance came from the dock's, only stunned silence. Even the British sentries stationed near the port didn't interfere. Perhaps they knew they were watching history, or perhaps they simply feared the storm. One by one, the figures climbed aboard the anchored ships. They worked methodically, opening crates, lifting chests, and hurling their contents overboard. The tea hit the water with heavy splashes, each sound louder than gunfire. Crate, splash, freedom. Crate, splash, defiance. More than 340 crates met their end that night, carried away by the icy tide into oblivion. The sea, dark and hungry, swallowed the empire's insult without flinching. On the shore, the people watched it all, men clutching woolen coats, women with children bundled at their sides, apprentices gripping cold hammers, just in case. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The act was clean, swift, and absolute. When it was over, the masked figures melted into the shadows. No names were shouted, no credit taken. It wasn't about fame. It was about freedom. The harbor, once silent, now churned with soaked leaves and broken crates. And yet it was as if the city itself had exhaled, finally free from a weight it had carried too long. The next morning, the sun rose over a harbor still dark with the ruins of tea. Governor Hollingsworth stood at his window, his face a frozen mask of fury. The British would demand retribution. Punishments would rain down, laws would be sharpened, troops would arrive. But East Vale had made its choice. The message had been carved into the tide, burned into memory, passed from street to street like gospel. We do not bow, we do not break, we do not sip obedience. The crown had played its final card. The colonies had responded not with violence but with symbolism, precision, and power. They had answered not with swords, but with soaked leaves. This was no riot. This was a revolution in disguise. And it had only just begun. Follow or subscribe the channel to witness how one night of tea tossing would become the spark that set an empire ablaze. You could smell rebellion before you saw it, not in fire or smoke but in something stranger. Soaked tea leaves rotting in salt water, the bitter perfume of empire undone. It wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a ritual. A shedding of old names, old rules, old chains right before the world's eyes. On that frostbitten night, under the bone-white moon of December 16th, 1000, 773. Dozens of cloaked figures moved silently through the narrow, frozen streets of Marrow's End, a city caught between obedience and uprising. These weren't unruly mobs or drunken fools. They were farmers, coopers, blacksmiths, printers, and clerks. With faces blackened by soot and rough feathers stitched to their caps, they weren't pretending to be anyone else. They were announcing they were something new, something fierce. Their destination, Crespin Wharf, where the 3 British tea ships, the Wren, the Empress Gale, and the Howley anchored in the frigid harbor like stubborn invaders. The wind howled through the rigging. The water beneath churned dark and oily with the sharp breath of winter. No one shouted. There were no flames. This wasn't chaos, it was calculation. With quiet purpose, they boarded the ships, tools in hand, small hatchets, thick clubs, and the determination of a people who had been ignored 1 year too many. The few sailors who remained aboard were nudged aside without violence, given sharp nods but no harm. These intruders weren't here to loot, they were here to erase. They knew exactly what they were doing. One by one, they cracked open the crate's massive wooden chests, sealed with wax and rope. The aroma hit first. Rich, foreign, spiced. A scent meant for drawing rooms and porcelain cups, not rebellion. The smell filled the air as they split the containers with practiced ease, spilling the British East Trade Company's prized cargo onto the decks. Then, without ceremony, the men heaved the chests overboard. One after another, they crashed into the water. Some burst open mid-air, spraying leaves across the surface like confetti at a funeral. Others sank in whole, groaning as they vanished into the depths. 342 crates in total. Nearly 100,000 pounds of tea. And the harbor turned black. On the docks, townsfolk stood motionless, bundled in cloaks, breath fogging in the night air. British sentries posted nearby didn't lift a hand to interfere. Whether they were frozen by confusion, sympathy, or fear of lighting the fuse, no one knew. Some whispered that even the king's men had felt the shift in the Iran, unspoken understanding that this was no ordinary protest. This was a point of no return. What set the night apart wasn't just the boldness but the discipline. Not a single trinket was taken. No ship was ransacked. No valuables were touched. In a town where many couldn't afford bread, the temptation was real, and yet every man resisted. This wasn't about gain. This was about principle, pure and brutal. The harbor, by midnight, looked like a giant black cauldron. Tea leaves clung to the surface, bobbing and circling in dark whirlpools. The tide carried the scent of bitter defiance through every alley and rooftop. Even the seagulls seemed to hesitate. And then, as silently as they came, the figures vanished, melting into the fog, slipping down alleys, returning to lives that would never again be ordinary. No names were claimed, no identities revealed. They left behind no banners, no chants, only the ghostly mark of something deeper in act, carved into the soul of a city. That night was not a riot. It was not a spectacle fueled by drink or fury. It was a calculated, deliberate declaration. We will not be ruled by trade and taxes. We are no longer subjects. At dawn, the city awoke to the smell of salt and steeped rebellion. The harbor was littered with wooden wreckage. Tea leaves had washed ashore like seaweed. The black water swirled like ink, staining the coastline with truth. And the truth spread fast. By midday, the story raced through Marrow's End and beyond, through whispers in taverns, over loaves in bakeries, in hastily printed broadsheets flung onto market stalls. From farmers to furriers, children to town elders, very one knew the tea ships had been emptied, not by looters, not by rioters, but by disciplined patriots acting in eerie, poetic unity. Among those who supported the movement, the reaction was thunderous. Pride swelled like a fire behind the ribs. Even those who hadn't dared participate felt it. The charge, the thrill of standing tall. It was no longer talk. This was action. This was war, still wrapped in silence. But others recoiled. To the royalists and moderates, it was reckless vandalism, too far, too fast. Property destroyed, Order broken. Had the colonies crossed a line they couldn't uncross? Governor Trent Hollingsworth, pacing the polished floorboards of his mansion, seethed, not just at the loss of goods, but at the boldness of the challenge. This wasn't some Stamp Act protest. This was open defiance. And if Marrow's End could do this, what city might be next? British officials, when word of the event crossed the Atlantic, reacted with stunned fury. This wasn't just a protest. It was insubordination turned physical, a humiliating mockery of royal power. Parliament blazed with debate. The Crown, already weary from colonial complaints, now demanded blood. King Gregor IV, when told, reportedly fell into cold silence. "So, they've made their choice," he said at last, his voice flat. And indeed, a choice had been made. The captains of the tea-shipsmen, with families, reputations, and trade licenses, could do nothing but file reports, their hands shaking as they scribbled out the losses. Over £10, 0 in damages, an unthinkable sum. But the real cost was something else. It wasn't just chests of tea that drowned that night. It was trust. The illusion that Britain ruled its colonies with consent. The hope that maybe, just maybe, the Atlantic was a bridge and not a border. Gone. That tea sank like a stone, and out of the depths rose revolution. This was no longer about tax stamps or shipping routes. It was about legitimacy, identity, future, and the people of Marrow's End of every colony felt it. That throb beneath their skin, that whisper in their bones. Something irreversible had occurred. The age of compromise was dying. The age of reckoning had begun. And Marrow's End, bold and bitter, stood ready. Follow or subscribe the channel to see what happened next, because this was only the splash before the storm. You could hear the silence before you saw the damage. Boston's harbourants, the beating, booming, brawling heart of the colony, had gone still. Not a whistle, not a shout. Just the slow slap of seawater against rotting docks. It wasn't just tea that had been sunk, it was Boston itself. And the Empire had no intention of letting it rise again. After the infamous night when hundreds of crates were dumped into the harbor like drowned symbols of defiance, the British Crown struck back, and not with dialogue or diplomacy. No, they brought down a hammer. The Port Closure Act, passed with vengeful speed, sealed Boston's fate. From that moment on, no ship could enter or leave until the East Empire Tea Company had been repaid. It wasn't a fine. It was a stranglehold. Trade vanished overnight. Fishermen had no market. Merchants watched warehouses go empty. Foreign ships rerouted to other ports, and Bostonance, a clattering hive of commerce, turned into a ghost town, wrapped in salt air and anger. And it didn't stop there. In the smoky chambers of Parliament, British lawmakers crafted a set of punishments so ruthless, so unmistakably imperial, that even loyalists winced. The Provincial Authority Act was next. Boston's locally elected government, its town meetings, magistrates, councils, was abolished with a single stroke, replaced by royal appointees who reported directly to the king. Boston was no longer a colony. It was a command post. Then came the Impunity Act. Under its twisted logic, any royal soldier or official accused of violence or abuse in the colonies could be shipped back to Britain for trial. And we all knew what that meant. No trial at all. No justice. No accountability. The message was unmistakable: those who wore redcoats walked above the law. But even that wasn't enough. The final insult was personal. British troops, those same grinning men who had once opened fire in the Boston Massacre, now ordered to live among the people, lodged in homes, inns, barns, not as guests, as enforcers, as watchers. Imagine opening your door and finding a musket-bearing stranger assigned to your kitchen. That was life under Britain's restored order. The Crown called these laws coercive measures, but in taverns and alleyways, in churches and farms, people called them something else: the tyrant's boot. The people of Boston suffered. No question. The price was cruel. Bread lines stretched across cobbled alleys. Children begged on the corners where taverns once sang with music. Ships lay idle, rotting at anchor, their sails limp with silence. But Britain had miscalculated, badly. They thought they could isolate Boston, turn it into a cautionary tale, an example. Instead, they turned it into a legend, a martyr. Boston didn't break, it became the bonfire. From the deep pines of Norwich to the tobacco fields of Langham, word of Boston's punishment lit a fuse. Across the other 12 colonies, resentment turned to rage turned to unity. For decades, the colonies had been awkward cousins, bickering over borders, competing for trade, divided by language, religion, even weather. But now, something new stirred in them, a common wound. They looked at Boston and realized, if they could do this to them, they'll do it to us. Caravans of supplies began rolling into the city, wagons loaded with flour, salted meat, blankets, candles, soap. Whole towns in Connecticut and Maryland emptied their storehouses to help Boston. A church in Yorkfield held a sermon where the congregation pledged their week's wages to aid the suffering Brothers of the Bay. And the letters, my God, the letters. They poured in like a storm-rolled parchment stained with ink and resolve, from farmers in the Carolinas, from printers in New York, from blacksmiths in the Delaware marshes. Some bore official seals. Others were just scratched in blocky handwriting on scraps of leather or old linen, but all of them carried the same heartbeat. We stand with you. Town meetings sprang up from barnyards to ballrooms. In Ravensbay, a tavern-turned assembly passed a vote calling Britain's laws acts of naked war. In Greystone, a militia captain offered 50 barrels of gunpowder and every able soul I can carry if Boston fell under siege. And beneath it all, the whispers grew louder. This was no longer Boston's fight. It was everyone's. And yet, while the colonies rallied, Britain dug in deeper. Parliament was furious, not just at the destruction of tea, but at the defiance it represented. To them, this wasn't about taxes. It was about authority, power, control. They didn't just want obedience, they wanted submission. So when they saw colonies gathering behind Boston, their response was predictable and catastrophic. They passed more laws, ordered more soldiers, began drawing up battle plans. The fuse had been lit, and it was burning toward war. But among the people, especially in Boston, there was no fear left, only resolve. Soldiers in red marched down cobblestones. Children spat behind their boots. Housewives left baskets of rotting fish on doorsteps where British officers slept. Even in the face of hunger, hardship, and armed occupation, the people of Boston refused to bend. Somewhere near the ruined docks, a young boy named Elias Corbin was caught sketching the British blockade in charcoal. When questioned, he answered, "So I can remember what to tear down one day." His words spread through taverns like wildfire. In a bakery near Anchor Row, a one-legged veteran of the French War named Joachim Fenn nailed a sign above his door. Bread for the brave, free for those who will stand. By trying to silence Boston, the Crown had only given it a louder voice. And the colonies listened. They watched as Boston bled, and rather than recoil, they leaned in. They sent supplies, they sent soldiers, and in taverns, steeples, and shadowed barns, they began to say the unthinkable, maybe we don't need Britain at all. The punishment had backfired. Instead of killing the cause, Britain gave it a name, a face, a fire. The Crown wanted obedience. What they created was revolution. Follow or subscribe the channel to see how that revolution became war, because what comes next isn't a story. It's a reckoning. The anger buzzed like a swarm raw, insistent, impossible to ignore. It vibrated through taverns and courthouses, echoed in the steady drumbeat of printing presses working through the night. Every sheet that rolled off a platen was laced with fury and purpose, flying from hand to hand faster than any royal decree could chase it. The fight was no longer Boston's lonely burden. It had become everyone's war. By the autumn of 1774, the colonies weren't just grumbling, they were waking up, not one by one, but together. The punishment doled out to Boston had done what years of taxes and skirmishes could not. It united the colonies under a common cause. And so, something unprecedented occurred, something unthinkable only months earlier. In early September, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia, each carrying the weight of their region's rage, hope, and uncertainty. The First Continental Congress was born not out of protocol or peacekeeping, but out of necessity, out of survival. The men who met in Carpenter's Hall were not yet rebels, not quite. Many still wore the cautious mask of loyalty to the British Crown. They arrived as Virginians, Carolinians, New Yorkers. But they left with something different, stitched into the lining of their coats. A dangerous idea. Perhaps they weren't 13 colonies anymore, but one people. Among the gathered voices were names that history would come to know by heart. George Washington, tall and silent, listening more than he spoke. Patrick Henry, already a firebrand whose words burned. John Adams, brimming with restless energy. And Samuel Adams, the architect of Boston's fury, whose ink-stained hands had written some of the rebellion's earliest lines. They weren't yet calling for independence, not officially. Many still hoped that Britain might listen, that King George III could be reasoned with, that Parliament might realize its overreach. But beneath their polished speeches and polite phrasing, something more urgent beat in their chests, an understanding that the old world was dying and a new one was being born. Over weeks of intense debate, the Congress made 3 bold decisions. First, they would launch a unified boycott of all British goods: no tea, no cloth, no sugar, no imports. Not one item would pass colonial docks under royal tariff without resistance. It was economic war, cloaked in civility. Second, they pledged mutual defense. If Britain struck again, it would not face a single province, but all of them. An attack on one would be an attack on all. This simple promise changed everything. No longer could the Crown pick off colonies like low-hanging fruit. They would now rise or fall together. And third, they issued a formal appeal to the king, not a surrender, but a final petition. A statement of grievances wrapped in respectful language. It was part olive branch, part warning shot. "We still hope for peace," they said, "but we are preparing for war." Outside the elegant hall where these ideas were hammered into ink, the streets of Philadelphia buzzed with gossip and nerves. Rumors swirled that the Congress might declare full independence any day. Tavern patrons toasted the United Colonies as if it were already a nation. In homes and farmsteads, people began to speak words that had once been whispered behind locked doors: liberty, unity, resistance. In truth, Boston's punishment had not stifled rebellion, it had ignited something greater. The image of that once bustling harbor, now silenced and locked, hung like a specter over every town meeting from Savannah to Saratoga. To the average colonist, Boston had become a symbol not just of sacrifice but of dignity, a city bloodied but unbroken, a reminder that tyranny, even when dressed in velvet and gold, could still be defied. As the leaves fell and winter neared, preparations for conflict grew bolder. Local militias began to drill in plain sight, their musket volleys echoing across frozen fields. Storehouses once filled with corn and grain now brimmed with powder, flint, and ball. Artisans who once forged horseshoes began crafting musket parts by lamplight. It was no longer theoretical. The colonies were arming. Even the most loyal subjects found themselves shifting uneasily. In public, they still toasted the king, but in private, many now hid their sons' names from royal recruiters and stocked food against a siege. The old loyalty was dying not in a burst, but in slow, steady cracks. And it had started the night the tea had sunk into Boston Harbor. That December evening had been more than a protest. It was a point of no return. No king, no red-coated army, no act of parliament could unmake it. It had destroyed something far more valuable than cargo, the illusion of harmony. And now, it was too late to pretend otherwise. Each passing month saw the colonies hardening. Resistance that had once worn the polite face of boycotts and petitions now clenched its fists. In taverns, men read aloud the resolutions of the Continental Congress as if they were holy writ. In churches, ministers replaced sermons about meekness with fiery declarations that liberty was a divine right. All around Boston, in the countryside and coastal towns, farmers left their plows to join impromptu militias. Minutemen, they were called, ready to rise at a moment's notice. No longer were they just tradesmen or tanners or butchers. They were becoming soldiers of a cause. Meanwhile, Britain watched with growing alarm. They had meant to isolate Boston, to punish and break it. Instead, they had unified their enemies. The colony of Virginia, once wary of Boston's defiance, now sent public letters of support. North Carolina voted to honor any boycott the Congress recommended. Even Georgia, the most loyal of the 13, sent quiet promises to help should war break out. What had been 13 scattered flames had begun to burn as one wildfire. By early 1775, the line had been drawn. Parliament refused to recognize the Congress's demands. The king dismissed their petitions as insolent scribbles from traitors. And still, the colonies prepared. Powder stores grew. Cannons were smuggled in under barrels of molasses. Maps of British fortifications were quietly copied and passed hand to hand. Something was coming. Everyone felt it. But for all the preparations, one truth haunted them. War meant blood. War meant burning towns, broken families, bodies buried under trees. It was no longer about taxes or tariffs. It was now about destiny. The crown had tried to silence a city, but in doing so, it had birthed a movement that now called itself something it had never dared say aloud. American. From the quiet lanes of New Haven to the wind-lashed ports of Charleston, the people began to understand that their stories, though different, were linked by a common thread. They were no longer just colonists. They were something new, something that had never existed before. A nation in the making. The winds of revolution no longer stirred, they howled, and Britain, for all its power, would soon learn the truth. You can shatter crates. You can close ports. But you can't chain an idea. Follow or subscribe the channel to witness what happens next when words give way to muskets, and a people decide to write their own history. It was never really about tea. It was about who owned your voice, your future, your freedom. By the spring of 1775, the colonies had shed any illusions of peace. The air around Boston was electric, not with ceremony or celebration, but with the quiet tension before a storm. You could feel it in the soil, in the glances shared between farmers and shopkeepers, in the silence of streets where once petitions were passed. This was no longer a protest, it was a reckoning. Outside the city, in the sleepy villages of Lexbridge and Hallowford names, the world would soon remember by blood and boleta. New chapter open. British redcoats, under strict orders, were sent to seize and destroy a growing stockpile of colonial arms hidden in barns and basements. What they found instead wasn't powder and shot, it was resolve. Ordinary men, blacksmiths and bakers, farmers and clerks, stood in the chill morning air, muskets in hand, hands shaking but hearts steady. They had no uniforms, no grand banners, but they had something else, a line they would not allow to be crossed. What followed was not some formal declaration or scroll read aloud by candlelight. The revolution began with the crack of flint against steel, the snap of gunpowder, and the echo of musket balls slicing through morning fog. The British fired. The colonists fired back. And in that instant, the world changed. It was in those first wild shots on the village green that the dream of empire fractured. The British crown, once seen as distant and mighty, had finally drawn blood on its own people. And the people? They didn't run, they answered. That deadly encounter could be traced like a straight thread through time aright, back to that night when rebels disguised in feathers and soot poured a king's tea into the harbor. It wasn't just a statement, it was a fuse. And now it had found flame. The so-called tea protest, once mocked by British officials as the work of rabble, now stood as the thunderclap before a storm. What those men had done wasn't about the price of a luxury item. It was about principle, about telling the world, we are not subjects, we are something new. Revolution doesn't always look like fireworks and waving flags. Sometimes it looks like a man standing ankle-deep in snow, staring down a trained soldier with a musket held at a trembling shoulder. It looks like torn paper, burned taxes, and broken crates floating in cold harbor waters. It begins in whispers, in secret meetings, in quiet declarations of enough. In destroying the tea, the colonists weren't rejecting a shipment. They were rejecting an identity. No longer would they be merely extensions of a distant empire. They were carving out something raw, uncertain, and wholly their own. And that was only the beginning. While the war drums now echoed from Concord to Carolina, the world's attention turned to a different kind of revelation, a forgotten city buried in the bones of Peru. Thousands of miles south, beneath the scorched skies of the Suwan Valley, a place long swallowed by dust was about to shatter our understanding of the past. Long before pyramids carved the Egyptian skyline, before Babylon rose, before even the whisper of Stonehenge touched the English earth, the city of Corlan stood in quiet splendor. It had no marble temples or golden thrones, just stone, sweat, and scale. It didn't need to conquer. It simply existed, magnificent in its stillness. At first glance, the Suwan Valley looked like a place where even time had forgotten to linger. A harsh, wind-scoured basin framed by jagged rock, where the river ran thin and slow, like silver spilled across sand. To most, it looked barren. But beneath that dust was a secret older than Pharaoh's. Where others saw hills, weather-worn and crumbling, archaeologists began to suspect more. With each brushstroke against ancient soil, the shape of something colossal began to emerge, a city, perfectly designed and breathtaking in scope, not a scattering of huts or nomadic encampments. This was architecture, purpose, civilization. Corlan spanned more than 150 acres. It was a metropolis before cities had names. Great plazas stretched wide, flanked by stepped pyramids that seemed to hold up the sky. Residential districts, amphitheater-like spaces, ceremonial corridors, they were all there, hidden just beneath the dust. And the people who built it? They had no wheel, no metal, no written language, only vision and an unbreakable sense of collective will. They built with earth, stone, and intention, without kings, without conquests, without war. For nearly 50 years, Corlan remained hidden, a phantom city. Even when early explorers stumbled across its mounds, they dismissed them as natural rises in the landscape. Just wind-worn hills, they thought, mere dunes. They had no idea that under their feet lay one of the oldest cities humanity ever dreamed into existence, centuries older than any we were taught to revere. It wasn't until the late 20th century that a determined archaeologist, Dr. Liana Vetra, followed the whispers of the wind and cracked open the silence. What she uncovered didn't just change the story of South America. It challenged the very foundation of how we define civilization. Corlan had no military stronghold, no treasure vault, no grand statues of gods demanding blood. Instead, it held something even more extraordinary, proof that human societies could grow not through conquest, but through cooperation. The people of Corlan engineered their buildings for durability and ritual. They used ropes of twisted plant fiber to map geometry. Their amphitheaters were tuned for acoustics. Their pyramids aligned with the sun and stars. They played instruments made of bone. They raised crops using a delicate irrigation system. They shared, they planned. They lived not as scattered families, but as a society. It's a quiet kind of Miracleone that whispers rather than shouts. And then, just as mysteriously as it had risen, Corlan was abandoned. Why, no one truly knows. Drought? Politics? A shift in trade? Or spiritual thought? It vanished into the wind without a final war or burning siege. Its stones simply went silent. But now, unearthed and reborn, Corlan has returned to the human timeline, and it forces us to ask, how many other great cities have we forgotten? How much wisdom sleeps beneath the soil, waiting for us to listen again. Just as Boston's harbor had once swallowed boxes of tea, the Swan Valley had swallowed a civilization. Both, in their own ways, became symbols, one of resistance, the other of endurance. Both remind us of a fundamental truth. History isn't just shaped by kings and wars. It's carved by ordinary people who dared to defy, dared to create, dared to believe. The American colonies, once shackled by royal decree, had torn loose the chains of subjugation, and as their muskets sparked beneath spring skies, their future cracked open like the earth itself. The people of Corallon, nameless and unsung, had built their legacy not through blood, but through vision and unity. And though their names are lost to time, their city now speaks again through stone, through wind, through every step taken across its dusty plazas. Two worlds, two moments, both echoing the same thing. We are more than what we are told to be. And that idea, the dangerous, powerful idea, changes everything. Follow or subscribe the channel to keep uncovering the secrets beneath our feet and the stories that shape us all. To the untrained eye, it looks like a dead land, sun-bleached, wind-scoured, and cursed, a graveyard of dreams, nothing more than dirt, dust, and silence. But to the people of Corallon, it was something else entirely. It wasn't a wasteland. It was a canvas, a challenge, a stage upon which they would build something the world had never seen, a civilization not carved out through war, but crafted through will. Where most saw sand and death, they saw life waiting to be summoned. The river that meandered weakly through the Swan Valley wasn't mocked for its modesty. It was revered, harnessed, loved. With patience, logic, and staggering perseverance, the early inhabitants of Corallon transformed that trickle into a lifeline. They carved irrigation channels into the desert floor, working not against the land but with it, learning to time their plantings with the rhythm of floods and seasons. And from that parched earth, green broke through. Beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes. But the real gold of Corallon wasn't something you could eat, it was cotton. White, soft, and plentiful, it became the currency of survival. They spun it into fishing nets, wove it into cloth, and used it to trade with distant coastal communities. Cotton became the thread that bound their economy to the larger world, and the Swan Valley became more than just habitable. It became powerful. But farming wasn't the only art they mastered. The people of Corallon understood something few ancient civilizations truly did. Nature wasn't an enemy to conquer, it was a force to understand. Their homes and ceremonial plazas were built not to defy the climate, but to live within it. Walls angled to temper wind, foundations designed to channel away rare floodwaters, and structures engineered to endure the occasional rumble of the earth. Their success wasn't brute force, it was brilliance. They read the stars like scripture. They map the sky not to worship, but to plan. Planting seasons, ceremonial dates, social rhythms, all calculated by the heavens. In an age without telescopes or writing, they still found a way to measure time with terrifying precision. Trade routes flourished. Dried fish from the coast flowed inland. Cotton and fruits journeyed outward. In return came rare stones from the highlands, brilliant shells from the Pacific, and foreign ideas carried by the quiet tide of travel. Corallon was no isolated outpost. It was a node in a growing network of exchange, a crossroad of knowledge. In the harshest of landscapes, they not only survived, they thrived. Their society wasn't just practical. It was visionary, a peaceful culture with no signs of war or conquest, no palaces littered with weapons. They built not for domination, but for durability. They weren't ruled by violence. They were ruled by intellect, ritual, and design. Corallon didn't just bloom, it became a beacon, and it was only beginning to rise. Out of the desert, like something conjured by myth, the pyramids of Corallon rose with impossible grace, towering sentinels carved not for vanity, but for purpose. They shattered every preconceived notion about early American societies. These weren't primitive mounds slapped together with guesswork. These were calculated, monumental works of architecture, the product of vision, patience, and astonishing coordination. At the heart of the city loomed the Grand Solstice Pyramid, the mightiest of them all, over 450 feet long, nearly 60 feet high. Not stacked stone by stone in chaos, but layered deliberately from river rock, sun-baked mud, and woven reed sacks filled with rubble. It was a fortress against time, against earthquake, against oblivion. Where empires crumble, this structure still stands. And unlike the tombs of Egypt or the burial chambers of later empires, Corleone's pyramids weren't graves. They weren't filled with corpses and curses. They were alive, constructed for ceremonies, public life, and communion. Temples crowned their peaks. Ramps and staircases offered access not to the dead, but to the divine. These spaces were where the people met the gods and each other. The top of the Grand Solstice Pyramid wasn't a place of death. It was a stage for rituals, for declarations, for the rhythms of a culture that had somehow built itself into legend before the rest of the world even knew it existed. Their architecture tells us something their lost voices no longer can. This was a society that believed in the future. They weren't just building for the now. They were building for generations they would never meet. Every block of stone, every sack of rubble, every plaza design was chosen not for ego, but for eternity. And for a while, they succeeded. Then, like a whisper vanishing in the wind, Corleone disappeared. No ruins of conquest, no cities burned to ash, no mass graves of war, just silence. Why? That question still haunts historians. Was it drought? Disease? Migration? A shift in spiritual thinking? No one knows. But what's certain is this: Corleone didn't fall in flames, it faded into memory, swallowed by sand. And for nearly 50 years, no one knew it had ever existed at all. Now that it's been unearthed, its story reshapes everything. Corleone is older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than the first bricks of Babylon. It defies the outdated timeline of civilized history and demands that we re-examine who we are, where we come from, and what civilization really means. Because what Corleone proves, what its pyramids whisper into the wind, is that you don't need kings or wars to build something immortal. You don't need steel or writing or conquest. You need vision. You need community. You need the quiet courage to believe that the impossible can be shaped out of sand. Corleone's greatest achievement wasn't its monuments. It was its people, thousands of individuals working together, not ruled by fear, but bound by shared purpose. They left behind no armies, no bloody legacies, no thunderous histories of empire. They left behind stone and silence and questions. But now, centuries later, the desert is giving up its secrets. And in the crumbling plazas and forgotten walls, a new truth rises. We have always been capable of greatness, long before we had kingdoms. And perhaps that greatness is not measured by what we conquer, but by what we choose to create. Follow or subscribe the channel, because the echoes of the ancient world are calling, and their stories are just beginning to be heard. Broad staircases, wide enough for ceremony and silent procession, rise from the dust like forgotten invitations. Fires once burned at their summits, casting flickering light over ritual platforms beneath a sky so wide it felt like a temple itself. The ancient city of Corleone wasn't just a settlement, it was a stage set beneath the cosmos. At the feet of the pyramids, vast sunken courtyards stretched in great circles, arenas not of bloodshed, but of gathering. These were spaces carved not to dominate, but to unify. Political councils, sacred rituals, and joyous festivals pulsed through these open plazas, drawing thousands together in harmony. Everything about Corleone's layout hinted at a society rooted in order, in unity, and in the knowledge that community was their greatest resource. Radiating from these ceremonial centers, smaller buildings dotted the sand, the homes of artisans, planners, priests, and farmers. These weren't the scattered homes of survival. They were structured, intentional, and aligned. The pyramids themselves were more than architectural marvels, they were clocks of stone. Their angles aligned with the solstice sunrises, the equinoxes, the constellations above. To the people of Corallon, architecture was a sacred language, written in the stars, translated into stone. To walk among the ruins today is to be humbled. No metal tools, no wheels, no pack animals, and yet symmetry and precision rule every structure. These were not crude piles of rock, they were geometric poems engineered for eternity. Not a single pyramid was built for conquest or royal burial. These towers of stone were raised to reach toward the divine, to bridge the chasm between earth and cosmos. And somehow, through 5 millennia of wind and silence, they still whisper. What makes Corallon truly extraordinary, though, is not what it built but what it chose not to. Beneath the sands, archaeologists have found no spears, no swords, no arrowheads or mass graves, no walls to keep invaders out, or towers to rain arrows down. The city has no scars of war, no fingerprints of conquest. In an ancient world where civilizations usually rose through violence, Corallon dared to rise in peace. That defies everything we expect. This was a society not powered by bloodshed, but by belief, not driven by plunder, but by trade. Their energy didn't go into armies, it went into astronomy. It went into music. It went into building something vast that didn't need to threaten anyone to last. Their plazas and pyramids were not odes to the dead or warnings to the enemy. They were sanctuaries of worship and gathering, places where people came to unite, not divide. When others built weapons, Corallon built networks. Trade was the pulse of its prosperity. Along the edges of the gentle Suan River, they grew fields of cotton not just to clothe themselves, but to weave into finely threaded fishing nets. These nets were then traded with coastal communities for dried fish, a vital source of protein. But the exchange didn't stop there. Corallon became the heart of a vast trade web, colorful shells washed in by Pacific tides, rare gemstones carried from the peaks of distant highlands, and even lush tropical fruits from valleys far beyond the desert's reach flowed into the city. This wasn't just a market, it was a map, a living connection between distant cultures. In the middle of it all, Corallon thrived. And it didn't just trade goods, it traded stories, it traded beliefs, it traded ritual and identity. Religious life wasn't a side note in Corallon, it was the foundation. The city's grand public spaces were living altars. Its sunken amphitheaters weren't just gathering places, they were sanctified stages. Ceremonies rang out into the air, rising like prayers into the desert wind. Rituals united not just families, but the entire community, giving shared rhythm to their seasons and lives. Music was their heartbeat. Bone flutes carved from the wings of condors sang high and strange across the plazas. Drums, stretched with deer hide, pounded deep into the earth, tethering sky to soil. These weren't just songs, they were symphonies of identity, echoing across the centuries. Leadership in Corallon didn't wear iron crowns or carry golden scepters. There's no sign of kings who ruled by fear. Power here seemed to flow through spiritual trust and civic stewardship. Someone had to coordinate those massive building projects, plan harvests, and negotiate trade routes. But they did it without the lash, without an army. Somehow, in a world so often defined by cruelty, this city grew from something else entirely: cooperation. No armies, no uprisings, no burned districts or battle-scarred monuments. In Corallon, power came from balance, from weaving community and cosmos into a single living pattern. It's a story almost too rare to believe. We've grown used to civilizations built atop corpses, crowned by conquest, drenched in the blood of enemies. But here, in the silence of a sun-soaked valley, another truth emerges: that greatness doesn't require slaughter, that you can raise cities without raising villages. Corallon is proof, a reminder that we are not condemned to repeat cycles of violence, that a people bound by vision, trust, and imagination can create something that not only survives the centuries but inspires them. And so, the stones still stand, the staircases still rise, the plazas still open like great hands in the earth, reaching upward, and the whispers of a forgotten peace still drift on the wind. Listen closely. You can still hear it. Follow or subscribe the channel for the next journey into the ruins, rituals, and revelations of forgotten empires, where every stone has a story and every silence a secret. You can still feel it, the low, steady hum of something ancient, not just buried stones or broken monuments, but a pulse, a vibration, deep in the bones of the land itself. In Coralon, it wasn't the clamor of war that echoed across the valley, but the rhythm of flutes, the beat of drums, the music of a civilization that sang its soul into the sand. Coralon was no ordinary city. It was a living, breathing composition, a place where architecture and ritual danced in harmony, where sound shaped space and ceremony was not a performance, but a way of life. As archaeologists peeled back centuries of dust, they unearthed treasures not made of gold or weaponry, but of sound. Flutes crafted from the hollow bones of condors and pelicans, whistles delicately shaped from antler tips, and compact drums stretched with the hides of wild animals. Each piece finely tuned, each note chosen. This wasn't idle music. It was deliberate. It was sacred. In a world with no written language, music became the voice of memory, a ritual language all its own. Picture it, twilight spreading soft purple across the valley. From the sunken ceremonial courts at the city's heart, the slow, resonant thump of drums begins to rise. Flutes join in, sharp and high like desert wind slipping between the stones. Bare feet stamp in rhythm upon the stone floors, echoing in the deep bowl of a circular plaza. Smoke from torches spirals upward as firelight flickers atop the pyramid platforms. Priests in elaborate woven garments stand tall beneath the open sky, their arms raised to the heavens, their chants rising with the wind. In those moments, Coralon wasn't just a city. It was a symphony. The city's layout wasn't accidental. It was designed like an instrument, plazas wide and open, shaped to carry voices and amplify movement. The circular courts weren't just aesthetic. They functioned as ancient amphitheaters, drawing the eyes and ears of the people toward the sacred center. It was architecture that listened as much as it stood. Above all this, the pyramids didn't loom in menace or domination. They rose like sacred mountains built by hand, linking the dusty ground to the celestial rhythm overhead. They weren't tombs. They weren't palaces. They were bridges between the people and the stars, between now and eternity. Rituals likely marked the rhythms of the year: solstices, equinoxes, the arrival of planting and harvest. These were not superstitious rites. They were mathematical, celestial, precise, a deep, complex relationship with the natural world. Music wasn't background noise. It was the ceremony itself, the thread that wove together human and divine. And what's most striking? No murals soaked in blood, no gods of war with snarling jaws, no altars blackened by human sacrifice. In Coralon, the sacred was a celebration. Reverence didn't demand death, it demanded unity. Even now, when the wind winds its way through broken walls and scattered stones, there are moments when the air almost sings, as if the ancient flutes are still echoing, as if the songs never truly ended. But Coralon's brilliance wasn't limited to music or faith. It was a marvel of engineering, a testament to what sheer human will and intelligence can achieve when guided not by conquest, but by collaboration. In a dry valley scoured by heat and thirst, the people of Coralon raised structures so massive, so deliberate, they continued to baffle modern minds. And they did it all without the tools the ancient world is supposed to need. No metal chisels, no wheels, no pack animals. Just hands, plants, and stone, and a vision that refused to accept the limits of the landscape. They built not with flimsy bricks, but with massive stones hauled across the dusty valley. How? They wove baskets from reeds that grew along the riverbanks, flexible but strong, capable of cradling heavy rocks across uneven terrain. One load at a time, layer by layer, structure after structure rose. But brute strength wasn't their only ally. They understood the land, and more importantly, they listened to it. Corralón sits in one of the most seismically unstable regions of Peru, a place where the ground itself occasionally turns against you. And yet, the pyramids, the plazas, the platforms have stood tall for thousands of years. Why? Because the builders of Corralón mastered earthquake-resistant design long before the concept ever had a name. They used wide foundations and rounded edges to absorb shock. They filled their structures with compacted rubble, a technique that dissipated seismic energy rather than resisting it. The walls could breathe with the earth, flexing rather than fracturing. This wasn't trial and error. This was knowledge inherited, practiced, perfected. They didn't just build on the earth. They built with it. And the marvels don't stop at stone. In a land starved for rain, the people of Corralón made water itself their ally. They created intricate irrigation systems, not flashy or grand, but effective. Seasonal floods were channeled, stored, and redistributed with precise planning. They tamed water without trying to conquer it. Corralón thrived because it understood a truth many civilizations never did. You don't have to dominate the land to master it. This was a people who worked with the rhythms of nature, not against them. A society that rose not on the backs of slaves or the swords of generals, but through shared labor, collective belief, and cultural brilliance. And for nearly 5,000 years, their stones have endured. Not because they were the strongest, but because they were the smartest. In every plaza, in every musical artifact, in every earthquake-resistant wall and irrigation trench, Corralón speaks. It tells us that progress isn't always born in war. That civilization can bloom not from conquest, but from connection. And that maybe, just maybe, our future could look a lot more like their past. So the next time you hear the wind stir through the silence of some forgotten ruin, don't just think of dust and bones. Think of music. Think of mathematics. Think of a people who turned desert into design, silence into sound, and stone into something sacred. Follow or subscribe the channel to continue this journey into the wonders of the ancient world where every forgotten city hides a truth we've only just begun to understand. In a landscape where water meant life or death, the ancient city of Corralón emerged as a triumph of design and ingenuity. Here, amid sun-baked valleys and unforgiving winds, people found a way not just to survive, but to flourish. Using a delicate network of hand-dug canals, channels, and flood-guiding systems, they coaxed every precious drop of river water to nourish their fields. Crops flourished under the blazing sun, even when rain abandoned the skies. Nothing was wasted. Every movement of water was calculated, intentional. The entire layout of Corralón reflected a mind-blowing level of urban vision. Major structures weren't dropped haphazardly into the desert. They were carefully aligned with the heavens themselves. The rising sun, the solstice, the movements of the stars, these events were built into the city's architecture. In the heart of the plazas, deep circular courtyards acted as both community spaces and celestial instruments. Priests, stargazers, and astronomers could track the sky's rhythm with pinpoint accuracy. Their knowledge wasn't just academics, it was survival. Even the city's organization hinted at a society that was both structured and spiritually centered. Living quarters, administrative halls, ceremonial platforms, they were all harmonized. There was no chaos in Corralón. There was order, balance, and vision, all woven together in stone. Modern engineers look at Corralón today with stunned admiration. Here was a society that didn't just build for the now, they built for forever. Their structures have outlived empires, braved centuries of tremors and tempests, and still stand defiantly under the open sky. Their secret? Working with nature, not against it. They listened to the land, and the land, in return, let their dreams take root. Corralón's pyramids, plazas, and palaces were once vibrant with life, a beacon of brilliance in the barren desert. For centuries, the city pulsed with music, trade, and ritual. And then, silence. There was no invasion. No flame or sword brought it down. No mass graves, no scorched monuments, no sudden collapse. Corralón simply faded, a quiet exhale of civilization, slowly swallowed by sand. Why did they leave? That mystery still haunts the windswept Supera Valley. Scholars today offer several theories, but none are certain. One idea points to climatea, long, brutal drought that might have choked the river dry. With no water, the crops would have shriveled. Trade, which depended on cotton and produce, would have faltered. The delicate balance Corrival maintained with its harsh environment may have simply tipped too far. Others argue that Corrival's dominance was outpaced by shifting trade routes. As neighboring cultures grew and new city-states rose inland and along the coast, Corrival's importance may have waned. Maybe the goods they once offered, cotton, fish, fruits, were no longer enough to maintain their economic influence. Some whisper of internal decline, power struggles, religious shifts, discontent from within. Without written records, we're left only to imagine. Perhaps after centuries of growth, even a peaceful people couldn't hold the seams of their society together. But whatever the cause, it wasn't sudden. It wasn't catastrophic. It was slow like the setting sun. Families likely drifted away, searching for greener valleys, fuller rivers, safer futures. Children who once danced in Corrival's plazas grew into adults in distant lands, carrying only stories. And stories, in time, turned to myth. The desert took back what was once a city. Winds swept through the empty corridors, laying down fine blankets of sand over pyramids and courtyards. Flutes once played at ceremonies were buried in silence. Walls disappeared beneath dunes, and the living hum of Corrival became nothing more than a sleeping whisper beneath the dust. For nearly 40 years, the world forgot. Travelers walked over the mounds, mistaking them for hills shaped by time and weather. The pyramids were dismissed as natural formations. The city became invisible, lost beneath the very earth it once tamed. And then everything changed. In the late 1990s, a team led by Peruvian archaeologist Dr. Rumasati ventured into the Supera Valley, chasing a hunch that the strange hills might be more than just ancient geology. What they uncovered would rewrite the story of the Americas Sand, shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about civilization. Stone by stone, layer by layer, Corrival re-emerged. Walls still straight, staircases still grand, plaza still echoing with purpose. This wasn't just a settlement, it was a full-blown city, older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than the streets of Ur, older than Stonehenge. It was a crown jewel of prehistory, quietly waiting to be found. Carbon dating revealed the unthinkable. Corrival had been thriving over 600 years ago. A civilization had built this magnificent city during the same era Mesopotamia and Egypt were rising. And yet, it had been completely unknown to modern history. Corrival didn't just challenge our assumptions, it demolished them. Until that moment, most scholars believed that urban complexity in the Americas developed much later, centuries behind the cradles of civilization in the Old World. Corrival proved that wasn't true. This city, with its grand architecture, advanced engineering, and deep cosmology, had emerged independently. It wasn't copying, it wasn't following, it was leading. Dr. Ruma's team uncovered not just structures, but stories. They found flutes, fishing nets, textiles, and a marvel called kipua, series of knotted cords used to encode information. They found ceremonial offerings, finely carved instruments, and evidence of vast trade networks. They found the fingerprints of a people whose minds were sharp, whose hands were skilled, and whose hearts burned with vision. Corrival's rediscovery wasn't just academic. It was spiritual. A resurrection, a voice, buried for millennia, had begun to speak again. Today, Corrival is honored as a UNESCO World Heritage City, a fragile monument to the brilliance of early humanity. Its pyramids, once brushed by ancient winds, now meet the curious steps of modern travelers. And though the city is still silent, its stones speak volumes. They tell us that history is wider than we imagined, that greatness isn't born only in violence, empire, or iron. Sometimes it begins in music, in trade, in ritual, in harmony. Long before the echoes of Rome, Before the gods of Athens or the warriors of Babylon, the people of Coraval were dreaming. They mapped the stars with no written script. They built pyramids without the wheel. They sang prayers into the wind, hoping that somewhere beyond the constellations, someone was listening. They believed in building, not destroying. Their greatness left no graves, only wonders. And so, Coraval stands not as a ruin, but as a reminder that human potential is universal, that wisdom isn't always forged in battle. That civilization can bloom in the dust, if guided by hands that shape, not crush. In a world often obsessed with conquest, Coraval offers a different kind of legacy, one of balance, of resilience, of enduring dreams. It tells us that progress doesn't belong to one people, or Placid is a shared fire that once lit the desert skies with music, with purpose, and with pride. So when you look across the sand-carved hills of Supera Valley today, and the wind starts to hum, listen carefully. You may just hear the breath of flutes, the murmur of markets, the chant of stargazers, and the quiet heartbeat of a civilization that never really vanished. They are still here in stone, in sand, in sky. They are Coraval, and their story is only just beginning. Follow or subscribe the channel to discover more lost worlds, silent cities, and the secrets of ancient brilliance hiding just beneath the surface.